There are those fleeting moments in life when an ordinary woman can create a quiet, opulent scene in a crowded restaurant. Not with money, not with power, but simply with a perfectly delivered answer in Italian. That night, Clara Bennett didn't know she had just changed her life, and the life of the most magnificent man she had ever met. If you're reading this story, hit like, comment with your city name. I want to know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you hooked. The thing about working a double shift on a Tuesday was that by 9 o'clock, your feet had stopped hurting. They'd moved past pain into something closer to numbness, a dull, distant awareness that your body was still attached to the floor, still moving, still carrying plates that cost more than your hourly wage just in the ingredients alone. Clara Bennett had learned to be grateful for the numbness. She moved through the dining room of Osteria Setanta with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 3 years. Not because she loved it, not because she had some romantic notion about the art of hospitality, but because Osteria Setanta paid $18 an hour plus tips that sometimes, on a good night, could cover half a month's rent. Clara needed every dollar of it. She was 30 years old. She had a studio apartment in Astoria that was exactly the size of most people's walk-in closets. She had $87 in her checking account, a student loan statement she'd stopped opening because the number at the top made her hands shake, and a graduate thesis on Renaissance cultural patronage that was 40 pages from finished and had been 40 pages from finished for 11 months. She had a part-time job at a university library on Monday and Wednesday mornings, a tutoring gig on Saturdays for a 14-year-old who hated Italian and whose parents paid $60 a session. And this, 4 nights a week at Osteria Setanta, carrying plates of handmade pasta to people who discussed their second homes, the way Clara discussed whether she could afford both groceries and her electricity bill. She wasn't bitter about it. That was the thing people always got wrong when they looked at her situation. Bitterness required a sense of entitlement, the belief that you deserved better, and someone had stolen it from you. Clara didn't feel that. What she felt most nights was simply tired. And underneath the tired, if she dug far enough, something that hadn't quite gone out yet. A stubborn, stupid ember of the idea that the thesis would get finished, that the degree would come through, that the years of learning 3 languages and reading dead historians would eventually amount to something she couldn't yet see the shape of. Most nights she could almost believe it. This was not most nights. Table 14 had been difficult since they sat down. There were 4 of them, 2 men in suits that cost what Clara made in 2 months, a woman wearing a watch that probably had its own insurance policy, and a 4th person who hadn't looked up from his phone since the bread arrived. The one doing most of the talking was the one facing the room, the one Clara had clocked immediately when she took their order because he had the particular quality of a man who was used to being the most important person in any space he entered. Not loud, not showy, just settled, like gravity bent slightly in his direction. She'd looked him up on her phone in the kitchen after taking their drink order because one of the other servers had whispered the name, and Clara had wanted context. Nathan Holloway, 32 years old. Founder and CEO of Holloway Hospitality Group, which owned 43 luxury hotels across North America and had recently expanded into Europe, worth somewhere between 4 and 5 billion, depending on which publication you believed. Widowed, 1 daughter. Known in business circles for being precise, demanding, and not particularly interested in softening either quality. The photo on his Wikipedia page made him look like someone had designed a handsome man and then forgot to give him a reason to smile. In person, he was worse, not uglier. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that he had the kind of face that knew it didn't need to offer anything. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that moved across a room like they were running calculations. The kind of effortless posture that came from a lifetime of never having to make yourself smaller. He spoke to his companions in short, precise sentences. He cut his food like he was solving a problem. He had not once made eye contact with Clara, which she told herself was a good thing, because the alternative, being noticed by Nathan Holloway, seemed like it would feel approximately like being noticed by weather. It was just past 9:15 when it happened. Clara was carrying a tray with 4 plates. The sea bass for the woman, the risotto for the man on the phone, the lamb for the one with the insurance policy watch, and the handmade tagliatelle al ragu for table 14's gravitational center. The tray was heavy. She'd been on her feet for 7 hours. The floor near the service corridor had been slightly damp all night from a pipe that maintenance had promised to look at and hadn't. She'd avoided it twice already. The third time, she didn't. Her foot caught the wet tile at a bad angle. It wasn't a fall. She didn't go down. She caught herself, one hand slamming the tray against her hip to stabilize it. But the momentum was already in motion. 2 plates slid. The sea bass stayed on the tray. The risotto stayed on the tray. The lamb hit the floor with a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a small explosion. And the tagliatelle al ragu. The handmade pasta that the kitchen had spent 40 minutes on. The centerpiece of the chef's autumn menu. The dish that cost $62 and looked like something a painter would be proud of, landed directly in Nathan Holloway's lap. The dining room went quiet the way a room does when something has happened that everyone knows is going to matter. Clara stood there for exactly 1 second, tray still in her hands, the ruined plates on the floor, the silence pressing in from every direction, and made the calculation that every service worker learns to make. How bad is this? Who is it? And what do you do next? The answers were, in order, very bad, Nathan Holloway, and apologize immediately and completely. I'm so sorry, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. I am deeply sorry, sir. Please let me... Don't. The word came out quiet and flat. He was looking down at his jacket, at the pale cream fabric now decorated with tomato and slow-cooked beef. The muscle in his jaw moved once. He reached for his napkin with the deliberate calm of someone who was very angry and had excellent control over it. Just don't. I'll have the kitchen prepare another. I don't want another. He set the napkin down. He looked up then, and Clara met his eyes for the first time, and she'd been right. It was very much like being noticed by weather, cold weather. Do you have any idea? He said, switching languages without warning or announcement, the Italian coming out of him like water from a tap turned fully open, smooth and Roman accented and contemptuous. What it costs to have this jacket cleaned. Do you have any idea who you just ruined the evening of? Or do they not teach basic competence here, along with whatever else they apparently don't teach? He wasn't speaking loudly. He didn't need to. The table beside them had gone still. A woman 2 seats away had turned slightly, the way people do when they're trying to watch something without appearing to watch it. His companions were silent. One of them, the one who'd been on his phone, had put it down for the first time all evening. Nathan Holloway continued in Italian, unhurried, the way someone speaks a language when they're using it specifically because they believe the person in front of them can't understand it. I've eaten in restaurants on 4 continents, and I have never been served by someone so catastrophically careless. This is exactly the kind of incompetence that makes me grateful I run my own hotels, where I can actually control whether the staff has the basic motor skills required to carry a plate from one location to another without turning it into a disaster. He picked up his water glass. He took a sip. He set it down. I'm sorry, he finished, still in Italian, his voice carrying the specific, weaponized courtesy of someone who isn't sorry at all. That no one has apparently explained to you that some of us have places to be and people waiting for us, and that the function of a waiter, however difficult it may seem, is to deliver food, not wear it. The silence after that was the loudest Clara had ever heard. She stood there with the ruined tray in her hands and felt, somewhere behind the professionalism and the numbness and the 7 hours on her feet, something she'd been pushing down all night rise up to the surface. Not anger, exactly. Something cleaner than anger. Something that came from the 40 pages still unwritten and the $87 in her checking account and 11 months of an ember that had refused to go out, and the 3 years of learning that the way you got through difficult things was by not letting difficult things convince you that you were less than what you were. She took a slow breath, and then she answered him. In Italian. Her Italian. The Italian of someone who had studied in Florence for a summer on a scholarship she'd applied for 6 times before they gave it to her, who had spent 3 years reading primary sources in the original language, whose thesis supervisor had once told her that her written Italian was better than her spoken English on a bad day. You're right, she said, in the same Roman register he'd used, calm and unhurried. I should have been more careful. I apologize for the jacket. I'll arrange for the restaurant to cover the cleaning costs. She watched his face. The first flicker of something. Surprise, quickly controlled. But I want to gently point out, she continued, that speaking critically of someone's competence in a language you believe they don't understand isn't quite the display of sophistication you might think it is. It's actually a fairly reliable indicator of the opposite. The room had gone so quiet that she could hear the jazz from the bar on the other side of the restaurant. And since we're discussing motor skills, she added, I've been carrying plates for 7 hours on a floor that has been wet near the service corridor since 5 o'clock. Your jacket can be cleaned. A broken wrist from a bad fall cannot. Perhaps your hotels, with their exceptional standards, have maintenance staff who address that kind of hazard before it becomes a problem. She set the tray carefully on the edge of the empty chair beside her. She straightened up. She met his eyes again, and this time she didn't look away first. I'll bring you the menu again, she said, in English now, her voice professionally warm. And I'll speak to the manager about the cleaning costs. Again, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. She picked up the tray and walked back toward the kitchen. She made it through the swinging door before her hands started shaking. What just happened? Said Marco, one of the line cooks, looking up from the grill. Because whatever just happened, it sounded like, don't, Clara said. She set the tray on the counter. She pressed her palms flat against the stainless steel and stared at the middle distance for 3 seconds. Don't say anything. Someone got Marcelo's ragu all over their… Marco, please. He went back to his grill. Clara breathed. Through the small window in the kitchen door, she could see table 14. Nathan Holloway had not moved. He was looking at the tablecloth in front of him. His companions were speaking quietly. The woman leaned toward him and said something. He shook his head once. He didn't look toward the kitchen, but his jaw was still doing that thing. The tight, controlled movement of someone recalibrating. Clara pressed her hands harder into the counter and told herself that the shaking would stop, and that she still had 3 more hours on her shift, and that she would deal with everything else later. She was right that the shaking stopped. She was wrong that everything else could wait until later. The manager, a thin man named Prescott, who wore his tie slightly too tight and had once explained to Clara that he saw his role as managing the experience architecture, found her at the service station at 9:47. I'm going to need you to finish out your tables and then clock out, he said. He didn't look at her directly. He was looking at the reservation screen on the stand, touching it like he needed something to do with his hands. We'll have your final check mailed to the address on file. Clara turned to look at him. I'm sorry? We're letting you go, tonight. Because of the drop. Because of the incident at table 14. Prescott. She kept her voice level. I dropped a plate on a wet floor that maintenance didn't fix, and then You confronted a guest. I responded to being insulted. You confronted a guest? He repeated, like she hadn't spoken, in front of the entire dining room. The kind of guest who matters, Clara. Do you understand what I'm saying? The kind of guest that this restaurant cannot afford to have a situation with. She stared at him. So I should have just stood there. You should have apologized and walked away. He called me incompetent, in Italian, because he thought I didn't understand him. What he said is not the issue. What you said, what I said was true. Prescott finally looked at her. He had the expression of someone who found the concept of fairness professionally inconvenient. Finish your tables. Your last check will be mailed. He started to turn away, then stopped. And Clara, I'd recommend not mentioning this when you apply elsewhere. Employers talk. He walked back toward the host stand. Clara watched him go. She felt the ember, the stupid, stubborn thing that had been keeping her functional for 11 months, flicker once, hard, like a match in wind. She finished her tables. She clocked out. She rode the N train back to Astoria with her coat in her lap and her tips in her pocket. $214, which was a good night, which was now the last good night she was going to have for a while. And she looked at the dark tunnel rushing past the window, and she did the math the way you do when the math is the only thing keeping panic from becoming the main event. Rent was due in 19 days. The library job paid $11 an hour, and she could maybe get 2 extra shifts. Maybe. The tutoring gig was $60 on Saturdays, which was 3 Saturdays before rent, which was $180. which when added to what was in her account brought her to approximately $267 against an $800 rent payment. She still had the tips from tonight. That helped. That brought her above the rent line, barely, with nothing left for utilities or food or the $63 due on her student loan. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the train window and let herself have 30 seconds of feeling exactly how bad this was. She'd learned to do this, to give the feeling a time limit, not to suppress it, because suppression was just fear with a delay attached, but to contain it. 30 seconds. Feel it fully. Then put it away and figure out what was next. The 30 seconds passed. She sat up straight and thought about what was next. She didn't think about Nathan Holloway at all. Nathan Holloway thought about Clara Bennett for approximately 4 hours after leaving the restaurant, which was unusual because Nathan Holloway did not typically think about people he just met for 4 hours. He did not think about most people for 4 minutes. He had, over the years, developed a fairly efficient system for categorizing and filing away human interactions. Useful, not useful, interesting, not interesting, that kept his mental space clear for the things that actually required it. Clara Bennett did not file properly. He was in the back seat of the car heading back to the Upper East Side, his daughter's school bag already packed by the housekeeper for tomorrow, his 11 o'clock call with his CFO already on the calendar, the ruined jacket already handed off to be dealt with. And he was still thinking about the woman at the restaurant, about the moment when she'd opened her mouth and the Italian had come out. Not just Italian, good Italian, Roman inflected, grammatically precise, the kind of spoken fluency that came from time spent in the country rather than a language app. He'd used Italian specifically because he'd wanted to say what he wanted to say without the performance of being overheard. He'd done it before, in situations like this, when he needed an outlet for the frustration that he was not. He was clear-eyed about this, always good at containing. It was not his most admirable quality. He knew that. But knowing and changing were two different operations. He hadn't expected her to answer. He hadn't expected the tone she'd used, not aggressive, not emotional, not the performance of wounded dignity that he'd braced for and knew how to manage. She'd been almost conversational about it. Steady, like she was pointing out an error in a document rather than responding to a public humiliation. The wet floor point had been particularly effective because it was completely correct, a hazard he would have flagged and addressed within the hour in any of his own properties. And the fact that she'd connected it directly to his comment about his hotels had been... He couldn't quite decide what word he wanted. Sharp. Specifically sharp in a way that required real-time thinking, not a prepared response. He'd been rude to her. He was aware of this. He'd been rude to her in a way that was, upon reflection, worse than what she'd done, because what she'd done was drop a plate on a wet floor, and what he'd done was use a language barrier as cover for saying things he wouldn't have said to her face. Except there hadn't been a language barrier. He looked out the car window at the city moving past. The streets were still busy at this hour. They always were in this part of Manhattan, people moving between restaurants and theaters and the particular social obligations of people who had the money and the need to be seen. He watched them without much interest. His phone buzzed. He looked down. It was his head of communications, Rebecca, he checked the time, 10:42 at night, which meant something had happened. "You're going to want to see this," she'd written. Someone at the restaurant had their phone out. "It's been up for 2 hours and it already has 300,000 views." He opened the link. The video was filmed from 2 tables away, slightly shaky, the audio imperfect but audible. You could see the plate drop, the moment of impact, the silence that followed. You could hear his voice in Italian, not every word but enough, the tone unmistakable even to someone who didn't speak the language. And then you could hear Clara's response, clear and level and devastating in the specific way that very calm people can be devastating when they've decided to say something true. The caption read, "POV, a billionaire thinks his waitress doesn't speak Italian. She does." He put his phone face down on the seat. "Problem?" said the driver, who had worked for him long enough to be allowed the occasional question. "Situation," Nathan said. "Nothing that changes tomorrow." But he picked the phone back up and watched the video again. He wasn't watching himself. He was watching her. The way she'd stood there after the plates went down, not frozen, not collapsing, just still. the way she'd set the tray down on the chair before she left, because even in that moment she hadn't just dropped it. Small things. The kind of small things that told you something about the texture of a person. He put the phone away again and looked out the window for the rest of the ride home. He'd been rude. He'd been caught. Those two facts existed and couldn't be undone. What he could do was decide what they meant going forward. The video had 600,000 views by the time he reached his front door. By morning, it had 4 million. Clara found out about the video the same way she found out about most things. Too late and from someone else. She'd slept badly. The math problem had followed her into sleep and rearranged itself into the kind of dream logic that wasn't quite a nightmare but wasn't restful. Numbers that didn't add up, doors that led to the same room, the specific anxiety of being late for something she couldn't quite remember. She woke at 6:15, lay there for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the building around her, and then got up because lying there wasn't doing anything useful. She made coffee in the small kitchen that was also part of the living room that was also where she kept her desk. She sat down at the desk with her thesis open on her laptop, the cursor blinking at the end of a sentence she'd started 3 weeks ago about Cosimo de' Medici's relationship with his architects, and stared at it for a while. The words didn't come. They often didn't come before 7. Her phone lit up with a text from her friend Yolanda, who she'd worked with at a different restaurant 2 years ago, and who was one of the 5 people in Clara's life who qualified as someone she'd call in an emergency. "Are you seeing this?" the text read. "Clara. Are you seeing this?" Then a link. She clicked it. She watched it. She watched herself drop the plates. She watched herself stand there. She listened to his voice in Italian, and in the slightly better audio of the video, she could pick up more than she'd registered in the moment, and it was worse than she'd remembered. And then she listened to herself respond. The view count at the bottom of the screen read 4.2 million. She sat there with her coffee going cold. Her phone started ringing. It was Yolanda. She answered. "You're viral," Yolanda said. "I see that." 4 million people, Clara. "I see that, Yolanda." "You told Nathan Holloway." "I know what I told him." "In Italian." "I know what language I told him in." There was a pause. "Are you okay?" Clara looked at the thesis on her laptop, at the blinking cursor, at the coffee she hadn't drunk. "I got fired last night," she said. "After the thing happened, Prescott let me go." Clara, that's illegal. I can't fight it. I don't have the time or the money to fight it. And anyway, he'll say it was the confrontation with the guest, not the drop. And she stopped. "I need to figure out what comes next. That's all." "Okay," Yolanda said, quietly, in the voice she used when she'd decided that her job was to be steady rather than helpful. "Okay, what do you need?" "I need another waitressing job, tonight if possible, and I need to not think about the 4 million people." "There might be some opportunity in the 4 million people." "Yolanda, I'm just saying, journalists are going to call. His PR team might reach out. You could..." "I'm not going to monetize a video of myself dropping plates." "It's not..." "I have to go. I'm going to the library. I'll call you tonight." She hung up. She drank the cold coffee. She opened her email and found, in the 3 hours since she'd slept, 47 messages from addresses she didn't recognize, several with the word media or press or news in the domain, and one, near the top, time-stamped at 6:03 a.m., from an address she didn't recognize, but that made her stop. "And Holloway?" "At hollowayhg.com. She stared at it for a long time. Then she clicked it open. It was short, no greeting, no preamble, no apology that preceded the point. Just, "Ms. Bennett, I would like to speak with you at your convenience. My assistant will contact you to arrange a time. Please confirm you're willing to take the call. N. Holloway." She read it 3 times. She typed and deleted 4 different responses. Then she wrote, "Mr. Holloway, I'm willing to take a call. I'm available tomorrow between 10 and noon. C. Bennett." She sent it before she could talk herself out of it. She wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. She wasn't sure what he wanted, or what the right version of wariness was here. or whether the ember in her chest had made a decision that her practical mind hadn't caught up to yet. What she knew was that $87 had become $301 with the tips from last night, that rent was in 19 days, that the thesis cursor was still blinking, and that Nathan Holloway, whatever else he was a man who'd sent an email at 6 in the morning after a very bad night. She didn't know what that meant about him, but she was curious enough to find out. Nathan's assistant called at 10:04 the next morning. Her name was Dana. She was efficient in the way that people who work for very demanding people become efficient. And she explained that Mr. Holloway would like to set up a time to speak with Ms. Bennett in person, at Ms. Bennett's convenience, at a location of Ms. Bennett's choosing. "He can come to you," Dana said, "if that's more comfortable." Clara was at the library. She was between the stacks, shelving returns, and she stopped with a copy of a 1987 monograph on Venetian trade routes in her hand. "He wants to come here?" "To wherever is convenient for you, yes." "Why?" A brief pause. The pause of an assistant who had been given instructions but not explanations. "I believe he wants to discuss a professional matter. He asked me to convey that it isn't related to the video and that he won't take more than 30 minutes of your time." Clara slid the book onto the shelf. She thought about the email, about the 6 a.m. timestamp. "Tell him I'll meet him at Angie's Coffee on Ditmars Boulevard in Astoria tomorrow at 11. It's a diner. He should dress down." Another pause. "I'll let him know." Nathan Holloway arrived at Angie's Coffee on Ditmars Boulevard at 10:58 in dark jeans, a gray sweater, and no visible security, which Clara had not entirely expected. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the frame of a man who was used to rooms adjusting for him entering them and recognizing that this particular room was not going to do that. And then he spotted her in the booth by the window and walked over. He looked different without the suit, not smaller exactly, just more present somehow. Like the suit had been a layer of code between him and the world, and without it you were getting something closer to the actual signal. He slid into the booth across from her. He didn't extend his hand. She didn't either. They looked at each other for a moment across a laminate table with a small vase containing a plastic flower. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "Thank you for coming to Astoria," she said. "I didn't think you would." "Why not?" "Because this," she gestured at the diner, the cracked vinyl booth, the coffee that cost $2.50 and came in a mug the size of a small bowl, "is not your natural habitat." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Not a smile. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The waitress, a woman named Rosie who had worked at Angie's for 20 years and who had stopped being impressed by anyone a long time ago, came over and poured coffee without asking. Nathan looked at the mug for a beat, then picked it up. "I want to apologize," he said. "What I said at the restaurant, the things I said in Italian, were not appropriate. The behavior that you called out was exactly what it was. I'm not going to explain it or qualify it." Clara wrapped both hands around her own mug. "Okay," she said. She waited. He seemed slightly surprised by the brevity of her response, which told her he'd prepared for the possibility that she'd push back. "Okay," he repeated. "You said the call wasn't about the video." "It's not." "Then what is it about?" He set down the mug. He looked at her with those calculation-running eyes, and she had the sense that what he was doing was something he didn't do often, being direct without the armor of a boardroom or a managed context. "I run 43 hotels," he said. "I'm in the process of acquiring a 44th, a historic property in Italy, the Gruppo Ferretti, which is a family-owned collection of 4 hotels in Tuscany and Umbria that have been operating continuously since the 1800s. The acquisition is complicated because the family is, understandably, protective of their legacy. They're not selling to just anyone. They care about cultural continuity. They care about who is going to be the custodian of properties that have survived 2 world wars and 5 generations of the same family." Clara listened. She was aware that her pulse had changed in a way she wasn't going to acknowledge. "My team has been working on this for 14 months, Nathan continued. "We've had 3 meetings with the family patriarch, Aldo Ferretti. who is 81 years old and spent 40 years of his life restoring those properties. Each meeting has gone well in theory and stalled in practice because, he paused, because Aldo Ferretti is an 81-year-old Italian man who wants to know that the person he's selling his family's legacy to understands what that legacy means, not in a business sense, in a human sense, in a historical sense. And my team, my very good, very capable team, cannot give him that conversation. Clara was quiet for a moment. But you think I can? I think, Nathan said carefully, that a woman who speaks fluent Roman-accented Italian, who referenced Renaissance architecture in what was apparently an off-the-cuff response in a very stressful situation, and who has, I had someone look into this yesterday, a half-finished graduate thesis on Renaissance cultural patronage in northern Italy might be exactly what this negotiation needs. The diner hummed around them. Rosie refilled someone's coffee, 2 tables over. The plastic flower in its vase sat between them, faithfully artificial. You had someone look into me, Clara said. Yes. Yesterday, the morning after. Yes. She looked at him. You dropped a waitress who answered back in Italian, and your immediate next thought was to run a background check and offer her a consulting job. Not a background check, a professional inquiry. He met her eyes. And yes, that's essentially what happened. That is a very unusual response to public humiliation. I'm an unusual person, or a very calculated one. He didn't deny it. That, she noted, was interesting. 6 weeks, he said, Florence and the surrounding properties. You'd be contracted as a cultural heritage consultant, a real contract, real pay, not a performance of one. $15,000 for the 6 weeks, plus expenses. Your role would be to facilitate the conversations that my team can't have, help us understand what Ferretti needs to hear in order to trust us, and serve as a cultural bridge between what we're offering and what he's protecting. $15,000. Clara did not let her face do anything with that number, but something in her chest did a thing that she'd classify later as hope-wearing work clothes. Why would I trust you? She said. You insulted me in a restaurant 2 days ago because you thought I couldn't understand you. Why would I get on a plane to Italy with you? Because, he said, the money is real, the contract is real, and I behaved badly at the restaurant because I was having a terrible evening and I took it out on the nearest available target, which was wrong, and I am not generally in the habit of making the same mistake twice. He picked up the coffee mug again. Also because, and I think you know this, you need the money, and you need something that looks like a career, and this is better than either of your other options right now. Clara felt a flash of something. Not quite anger, a sharper cousin of it. That's very direct. I thought you'd prefer it. She stared at him. He stared back. The plastic flower sat between them. I want to see the contract before I agree to anything, she said. My lawyer will have it to you by tomorrow morning. I want a non-disclosure with mutuality. If I'm protecting your information, you're protecting mine. He nodded once. Done. And I want it in writing that my role is consultant, not assistant. I'm not carrying bags. I'm not booking restaurants. I'm there to talk to Aldo Ferretti about his hotels. Understood. And I want a week to review it. I can give you 3 days. We leave in 10. She looked at him. 10 days. 10 days, he confirmed. Clara Bennett looked out the window at Ditmars Boulevard, at the people going about their Wednesday, at the dry cleaner and the pharmacy and the halal cart on the corner that she bought lunch from sometimes because it was $4 for a chicken and rice plate, and that was a meal that fit in her budget. She looked at the thesis she hadn't been able to finish, at the $87, 301 now, in her account, at the 11 months of an ember that hadn't gone out. Then she looked back at Nathan Holloway, who was watching her with the expression of a man who had made an offer he believed was correct and was waiting for the world to confirm it. 3 days, she said. Send the contract. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat for a moment in the booth at Angie's on Ditmars Boulevard, across a laminate table, neither of them quite knowing what had just been set in motion. Outside, the city moved past the window, indifferent and ongoing, as it always did when people were making decisions that would change everything. The contract arrived at 7:42 in the morning, 2 days after the diner. Clara read it 3 times. Once quickly, once slowly with a notepad, once more with the specific attention of someone who had learned, through several bad experiences with landlords and financial aid offices, that the thing that was going to cause the problem was always in the paragraph that looked the most boring. It was clean. Cleaner than she'd expected. The language was precise without being predatory, the scope was defined. The mutual NDA was exactly what she'd asked for. $15,000, structured as $5,000 up front, 5 at the midpoint, 5 at the completion of the 6-week engagement. Travel and accommodation covered. Her role listed as independent cultural heritage consultant, not assistant, not support staff, not anything that could be interpreted as subordinate. She had a specific set of responsibilities and a specific set of protections, and the contract contained, in the 3rd paragraph of the addendum, a clause that said Holloway Hospitality Group could not leverage her participation in any marketing or public communications without her separate written consent. That last one she hadn't asked for. He'd put it in anyway. She signed it and sent it back before she could find a reason not to. The $5,000 hit her account the next morning. She sat with her phone in her hand for a long time, looking at the balance. Then she paid rent 2 weeks early for the first time in 3 years, transferred money to cover her utilities through the following month, and bought a plane ticket for her thesis supervisor, Professor Anand Mehta, to come to New York so she could hand-deliver the draft chapters she'd been holding back because she was afraid to let anyone read them. She didn't actually buy the ticket, but she thought about it, which was the closest she'd been to that particular act of optimism in a long time. What she actually did was call Yolanda. "I signed it," she said. A long pause. "You signed it." "I did." "Clara." Another pause. "You're going to Florence. For 6 weeks. With Nathan Holloway. As his cultural consultant. It's a professional engagement." "I know what it is," Yolanda said. "I'm just saying, are you okay? Like, in your actual body? Are you physically okay?" Clara looked at her apartment, at the desk with the thesis, at the small kitchen, at the window that looked out on the building across the alley, where someone had left a bicycle on their fire escape for the past 8 months. "I'm terrified," she said, "but I think that's probably correct." "Yeah," Yolanda said. "Yeah, I think that's probably right." They left on a Thursday morning out of JFK business class, which Clara had flown in exactly once before, on the way to Florence for her scholarship summer, when the airline had upgraded her by accident and she'd spent 4 hours convinced they were going to realize the mistake and move her. This time the seat was on the contract. She settled into it with her notebook and her noise-canceling headphones, and her copy of a biography of Aldo Ferretti's father that she'd found in a used bookstore on the Upper West Side and paid $22 for, which now felt like the best money she'd spent in months. Nathan sat across the aisle. He had a laptop open and a phone in his left hand before the plane finished pushing back, and he didn't look up from either for the first 2 hours. His COO, a compact man named Garrett, who had the energy of someone who had replaced sleep with purpose, sat 1 row ahead and occasionally leaned back to hand Nathan documents that Nathan would sign or annotate and hand back. There was a woman from the legal team named Priya, who did the same thing with different documents. It was, Clara observed from behind her biography, less like a business trip and more like a mobile office that happened to also be a plane. She read, she took notes, she learned things about Salvatore Ferretti, Aldo's father, that she hadn't known before. That he had started restoring the first hotel, Villa Ferretti in the hills outside Siena, in 1962, after it had been used as a German command post during the war and left in near ruin. That the restoration had taken 11 years and nearly bankrupted the family twice. That Salvatore had died in 1989, the year the 4th hotel opened, and that Aldo had been standing in the lobby when the last stone was placed, and had reportedly not said a single word for the rest of the day. She was reading about the Second Restoration, a 13th century convent in Umbria that Salvatore had purchased for essentially nothing in 1974, when Nathan said across the aisle, "What are you reading?" She looked up. He'd closed the laptop. Garrett was asleep. Priya had headphones in. The cabin had reached the particular nighttime quiet of a long flight where most people had given up on being awake. "A biography of Salvatore Ferretti," she said. Aldo's father, the one who started the hotels. I've read the Ferretti family history. My research team put together a 120-page briefing document. Is the convent in the briefing document? Which convent? The one in Umbria, Santa Caterina. Salvatore bought it in 1974 for 40,000 lire, which is essentially nothing, even adjusted, and spent 6 years restoring it without any professional architectural guidance because he couldn't afford to hire anyone. He did most of the stonework himself. The book has photographs. She turned it so he could see the page. Even in black and white, the image was striking. A heavy-set man in his 40s, covered in dust, crouching beside a section of medieval wall with a trowel in his hand. Nathan leaned slightly across the aisle to look. That's not in the briefing document. It's probably not in any database either. The book is out of print. I bought it in a used bookstore. She turned the page back. Aldo Ferretti grew up watching his father do that, watching him put the stones back one at a time. Whatever you offer him, whatever the number is, whatever the terms are, that's what he's going to be thinking about. Whether you understand that what he's selling isn't a hotel group, it's the stones his father put back. Nathan was quiet for a moment. That's why the 14 months have stalled. Probably. She turned another page. Your team understands the business. That's clear. But Aldo doesn't need to understand your business. He needs to believe you understand his. And you think you can make him believe that? She looked at him over the top of the book. I think I can have the conversation that makes it possible for him to believe it. I can't do it for you, but I can build the room where it happens. Nathan looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't quite the calculation face, that was something slightly different from the running of numbers look, something that took a fraction longer and seemed to go somewhere she couldn't quite track. Get some sleep, he said. We land in 5 hours. She went back to her book, but she noticed, before she put her headphones back in, that he didn't reopen the laptop. He sat with his hands loosely in his lap and looked out the window at the dark over the Atlantic, and she wondered what he was thinking about that wasn't the acquisition. Florence in October was exactly what Florence in October always was, which meant it was unreasonably beautiful in the specific way that made Clara faintly angry at herself for finding it unreasonably beautiful, because she knew the light was the light, and the stone was the stone, and the hills in the distance were the hills in the distance, and none of that was arranged for her benefit. And yet every time she came here, she felt the city doing something to her chest that she'd never been able to properly describe, and had stopped trying. They were staying at a property the company had already acquired the previous year, a small, impeccably restored palazzo in the Old Trarno district that served as both the team's base of operations, and Nathan told her during the car ride from the airport, an example of what Holloway Group's European properties looked like when they were done right. It was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, not the curated performance of beauty that some luxury hotels specialized in. Someone had cared about this building. The original frescoes in the entrance hall had been restored rather than painted over. The courtyard had actual orange trees rather than decorative ones. The floors were the original Florentine Pietraserina, and they weren't level in several places, and no one had tried to fix that. Who did the restoration? She asked, standing in the entrance hall with her bag still over her shoulder. An architectural firm from Rome. We spent 2 years with them before we touched anything. It shows. She ran her hand along the wall near the fresco, the plaster slightly uneven, slightly cool. This is good. This is the right argument for Aldo Ferretti. That's the plan. She looked at him. You should bring him here, before any of the formal meetings. Don't present it as an argument, just bring him here. Let him walk through it. Let him see that you know what restoration means. Nathan was looking at the fresco. That's not in the negotiation strategy. I know. It should be. He was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to Garrett. The first meeting with Aldo Ferretti was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave Clara 4 days to prepare and, as it turned out, to exist in Florence in a way she hadn't since the scholarship summer 8 years ago. She went to the Uffizi on Saturday morning when it opened, before the crowds, and stood in front of the Botticelli rooms for a long time. She walked across the Ponte Vecchio at 6 a.m. on Sunday, when the jewelry shops were shuttered and the only other people on the bridge were a man walking a dog, and a couple of tourists who hadn't slept yet. She went to the Bargello and stood in front of Donatello's David, the bronze one, the real one, the one that most people walked past to get to Michelangelo's, and thought about what it meant to make something that survived 500 years. She also, when she wasn't doing any of that, sat at the desk in her room at the Palazzo and worked on the thesis. The 40 pages seemed slightly less impossible in Florence. Something about the proximity to the primary sources, even though she wasn't going to the archives on this trip, even though the archives were in Rome and Venice anyway, made the sentences come easier. She wrote 12 pages in 3 days, which was more than she'd written in the previous 4 months combined. She didn't tell Nathan about the thesis. She wasn't sure why. It felt like a separate thing, a private thing, something that existed in a different compartment from this arrangement, this 6-week professional engagement that had sprung up from a dropped plate and an Italian insult in a 6 a.m. email. She kept the compartments separate because the alternative, allowing them to blur, seemed dangerous in a way she didn't want to examine directly. Nathan, for his part, seemed to operate in a state of perpetual focused motion that occasionally paused long enough to surprise her. On Friday evening, she found him in the courtyard of the Palazzo at 8 o'clock, sitting on the low wall beside the orange trees, on the phone, but not in the way he was usually on the phone. This was different, softer. She almost didn't interrupt and then heard him say, in a voice that was quieter than any voice she'd heard from him yet, "I know, Monkey. I know. 4 more days and then we do the video call, okay? I promise. Yes. The orange trees." He looked up at the trees. "They're real. They smell real. I'll show you." Clara had already turned to go back inside when he said, without looking away from the trees, "She's 5. She's convinced Italy has fake trees because I told her the ones in her classroom are plastic, and now she's generalized." Clara stopped. She's not wrong to be suspicious. The ones in her classroom sound unreliable. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him get to one. She's got a stuffed rabbit named Bernard that has to sleep on the left side of her pillow or she can't fall asleep. If Bernard gets moved, the whole night is finished. Does Bernard travel? Bernard does not travel. Bernard is a structural element. Bernard stays at home. He looked down at his phone. "Her name is Lily." "I know," Clara said. "I saw her name in the briefing document. The company biography lists her. 15 words in a 4-page biography." He set the phone on the wall beside him. "She's the reason I'm in Florence trying to buy hotels." Clara sat on the other end of the low wall, leaving a reasonable amount of courtyard between them. The orange trees smelled like they were supposed to smell. The evening was cool and clear, and the sound of the street outside the palazzo was muffled by the stone walls. "How so?" she asked. "Her mother died when Lily was 2. He said it the way someone says something they've said many times. Not without weight, but without the acute edges anymore. The way a scar is different from a wound. Elena, she was very specific about family legacy, about things that last. She was Italian, actually, 3rd-generation Italian-American, but she spoke the language and she cared about the history. She was the one who first told me about the Ferretti properties, years before the acquisition was even a thought." He paused. "She wanted Lily to grow up understanding that things of real value take generations to build, that there's worth in preservation. I didn't entirely understand what she meant when she said it." He looked at the trees. "I'm starting to." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your wife." "Thank you." A beat. She would have been very annoyed about the jacket incident, for what it's worth. She would have said, "I deserved exactly what happened." She would have been right. He looked at her then. And for a moment, just a moment, the calculation face was entirely gone, and what was there instead was something simpler and considerably more human. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." They sat in the courtyard for a few more minutes without talking, which was not uncomfortable, which Clara noted as significant because, in her experience, silence with someone you didn't know well was almost always uncomfortable. Then she went back inside. He stayed with the orange trees. Aldo Ferretti was 81 years old and had the posture of a man who had spent decades refusing to acknowledge that gravity existed. He was not tall, but he occupied space in a way that had nothing to do with height. a quality Claire had only ever seen in people who were completely, unsentimentally certain of their own worth. He arrived at the palazzo on Monday morning in a dark suit that was at least 30 years old and had been pressed within an inch of its life, accompanied by his granddaughter Julia, who was about Clara's age and served as both his translator and, Clara suspected, his judge of character. Aldo spoke Italian. He spoke it fluently, precisely, and with a Tuscan accent that Clara had to recalibrate to after years of training her ear on Roman and Florentine registers. He had been told there would be a cultural consultant present. He had not been told she was American. When they were introduced, he looked at her with the specific assessment of an 81-year-old man who had been evaluating people for 60 years and had gotten very good at it. He said, in Italian, "You speak Italian?" "Reasonably well," Clara said, in Italian, "though your Tuscan is going to make me work for it." He blinked. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite amusement, but the architecture of it. He looked at Nathan, who was standing slightly to Clara's left, and said, still in Italian, "Where did you find this one?" "She found me," Nathan said. His Italian was good, fluent but American accented, the Italian of someone who had learned it as an adult with real application. He'd told Clara on the drive over that he'd studied intensively before the first Ferretti meeting 14 months ago. Aldo looked at Nathan for a moment with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Then he nodded, once, and sat down at the table. The meeting was supposed to be 2 hours. It ran 4. What Nathan's team had been doing for 14 months, Clara understood within the first 20 minutes, was conducting excellent business negotiations. Clear terms, fair valuations, well-researched proposals about operational continuity and brand preservation. All of it correct, all of it thorough, all of it aimed slightly wide of what Aldo Ferretti actually needed. What Aldo actually needed was to talk about his father. Clara saw it early. The way his eyes went slightly distant whenever the conversation moved to financials, the way he came back to life when she mentioned, during a pause in the formal presentation, the photograph she'd seen in the biography, the one of Salvatore with the trowel. "That photograph?" Aldo said, and stopped. "Santa Caterina," Clara said. "The Umbrian property, 1974. Aldo looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite suspicion. "You know this photograph." "I found the biography in a bookstore in New York, out of print." "There were 300 copies printed," Aldo said. "My father paid for it himself." He was quiet for a moment. "That photograph was taken by my mother. She went to document the restoration because she was afraid he was going to hurt himself. He had no training. He had a book about medieval stonework and a stubbornness that would have embarrassed a mule." Something softened in his voice. "He fixed the wall. It took him 3 months. The same wall is still standing." "I know," Clara said. "I read about it." Aldo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathan. "She read about it," he said. Not quite to either of them. Nathan, to his credit, was quiet. Clara had noticed, in the few days they'd worked in proximity, that he was good at reading a room when he was paying attention. And right now he was paying attention. He'd been listening for 20 minutes, which was not, she suspected, his natural preference. And he'd done it without performing patience, which was harder than it looked. "The wall at Santa Caterina," Clara said, "is the reason I think this acquisition is possible in a way it hasn't been before. Because Mr. Holloway's team hasn't just offered you a number. They've spent 2 years on the palazzo in Oltrarno. Have you seen it?" Aldo frowned. "I know the palazzo." "Have you seen what they did with it?" A pause. "I've heard." "I'd like to take you there this afternoon," Clara said. "If you're willing." Aldo looked at her, at Nathan, at his granddaughter Julia, who had been watching the whole exchange with the expression of someone who had just seen something she hadn't expected to see and was still deciding what to do with it. "After lunch," Aldo said. Nathan looked at Clara across the table. She kept her face professional. But something passed between them, a small, quick thing, like the flicker of a light in another room, that she registered and set aside. They walked through the restored palazzo at 4 in the afternoon, Aldo and Julia and Nathan and Clara and Garrett, who had the sense to stay several steps behind. Aldo moved slowly. He touched things. He stopped at the entrance hall fresco for a very long time and said nothing, his hands clasped behind his back. He ran 2 fingers along the wall the same way Clara had her first day, feeling the unevenness of the restored plaster. He crouched, slowly, with visible effort, beside the base of a column in the courtyard and looked at the stonework at the level where it met the floor. "The joint here," he said to no one in particular, in Italian. "They didn't try to hide it." "The original floor meeting the restored column," Clara said, crouching beside him. "Different stone ages. They left it visible." "It's honest," Aldo said. He stood up slowly. He looked at Nathan, who had followed them and was standing a few feet back. "You told them to leave it?" "My architect told me it was more truthful this way," Nathan said. I agreed with him. Aldo studied him. "In my experience, Americans prefer things to look seamless." "Some things should look seamless," Nathan said. "A historic building isn't one of them. The seam is part of the history." Aldo was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the column, he looked at the courtyard, at the orange trees. "My father would have argued with you about the stone," he said finally. "He had very specific opinions about limestone versus sandstone in certain foundational applications. He was not always right, but he was always very detailed about being wrong." He almost smiled. He would have enjoyed this argument. "I would have liked to have it with him," Nathan said. "It wasn't performed. That was the thing." Clara was watching Nathan carefully enough by now to know the difference, and it wasn't performed. He meant it, or something close enough to meaning it, that the difference didn't matter. And Aldo heard it the same way she did, she could tell, because something in the old man's posture shifted very slightly, like a door that had been sitting at 45 degrees, moving another 10 degrees toward open. They had dinner that evening, the 6 of them, which had not been planned, which happened because Aldo suggested it as they were leaving the palazzo, and Nathan accepted without looking at Garrett for confirmation. They ate at a restaurant near the Arno that Aldo had apparently been going to for 50 years, where the menu wasn't printed because everyone who mattered already knew what was good. The wine came without ordering. The food came without decisions. Clara sat across from Julia, who had been watching her all day with an expression that had started as suspicion and was slowly, meal by meal, becoming something more like curiosity. "Where did you study?" Julia asked in Italian when the antipasto arrived. "NYU," Clara said, "and a summer at the Lorenzo de' Medici Institute in Florence. Years ago." "Your accent is Roman." "I had a Roman professor. It infected everything." Julia smiled for the first time. "My mother is Roman. My grandfather pretends to forgive her for it." Across the table, Aldo was talking to Nathan in a mixture of Italian and English, the Italian coming when he wanted to say something precise, and the English when he was checking whether Nathan was following. Nathan was following. He was asking questions, not deal questions, not acquisition questions, questions about the Umbrian property, about the restoration of the frescoes at Villa Ferretti, about which craftsmen the family had used for the stonework, and whether those relationships still existed. Clara watched him and thought about the man who had switched to Italian in a restaurant to say cruel things to a woman he believed couldn't hear him. She tried to connect that person to this one, this man who was asking an 81-year-old Italian patriarch about medieval frescoes with what appeared to be genuine interest, and found that the distance between the two versions was both larger and smaller than she'd expected, larger because the restaurant behavior was genuinely bad, and the dinner table behavior was genuinely good. Smaller because she could see now that both came from the same source, a person who was operating at the edge of his own capacity, who hadn't quite figured out how to account for the parts of himself that spilled over when the management systems got overloaded. She wasn't excusing it, but she was understanding it, which was different. By the time the secondo arrived, Aldo and Nathan were deep into a conversation about the particular challenges of maintaining historic wine cellars in buildings with medieval foundations that had not been designed to be wine cellars, and whose architects had opinions about moisture that were, Aldo said, correct in theory and catastrophically wrong in practice. Nathan laughed, a real laugh, slightly surprised, the kind that came out before the management system caught it. Aldo looked pleased. Julia refilled Clara's wine glass. "He's better than I expected," she said quietly. About Nathan. "He's better than he appears," Clara said, "which is its own problem." Julia looked at her. "Why is that a problem?" Clara picked up the wine glass. "Because appearing badly is how he makes the first impression, and first impressions take a while to undo." "His first impression with my grandfather is this dinner," Julia said, "and it's going well." I know, Clara said. I'm glad. She meant it. She was also aware, sitting at that table with the Arno 2 blocks away, and the wine warm in her chest and the conversation flowing between the 4 languages of the evening: Italian, English, the language of old buildings and inherited responsibility, and whatever it was that Nathan and Aldo were speaking now, the private language of men who had decided to try trusting each other. That she was glad in a way that was slightly more complicated than professional satisfaction. She set the wine down and listened to the conversation and didn't examine the complication. The next 2 weeks moved the way good work moves when the right people are finally in the right room. Not smoothly, nothing about it was smooth. There were 3 separate evenings when Aldo's lawyers sent counterterms that Garrett called Clara at 11 p.m. to discuss, and one afternoon when Aldo himself refused to continue a meeting because he felt the proposed operational structure disrespected the role of the family's long-term staff, and he was correct to feel that way, and Clara told Nathan so directly, and Nathan modified the structure, and Aldo came back to the table the next morning. She and Nathan fell into a working rhythm that neither of them had planned, and neither of them acknowledged directly. They debriefed after every meeting, usually in the courtyard of the palazzo with whatever was left of the afternoon, and the debriefs would start as tactical discussions. What Aldo had responded to, what had landed wrong, what needed to change, and would sometimes end as something else. Conversations that went sideways in the good way. He told her about the hotel in Vancouver that had been his first acquisition when he was 26 and couldn't get a loan from 3 different banks and had mortgaged his apartment to make the down payment work. She told him about the first time she'd read Vasari's Lives of the Artists in the original Italian, sitting in a university library in her sophomore year, the specific sensation of a language becoming transparent, of not translating anymore but simply reading. That's what fluency actually is, he said, the moment the translation stops. Yes, she said, slightly surprised. It's the same in business. There's a period when you're running calculations, checking the logic, verifying the assumptions, and then at some point you stop running the calculations and you just know. The translation stops. She looked at him. That's a surprisingly poetic observation for a man who spent the first meeting with Aldo discussing mortgage structures. I contain multitudes, he said, completely deadpan. She laughed. Actually laughed, which she hadn't been expecting. He looked very briefly like he hadn't been expecting it either, like it had done something to the air in the courtyard that neither of them had anticipated. Clara looked away first. She picked up her notes. One evening in the 3rd week, she came back from a late walk along the Arno to find Nathan in the small sitting room off the main entrance. His laptop closed for once, a glass of grappa untouched on the table beside him, on a video call on his phone that she could hear before she could see. She heard Lily first, a child's voice, high and decisive. Bernard is mad because you were gone when I woke up. I know, Nathan said. Tell Bernard I'll make it up to him. Bernard doesn't negotiate. Everyone negotiates eventually. Bernard doesn't. Clara stopped in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt, but she could see through the half-open door. Nathan holding the phone, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and on the screen, partially visible, a small girl with dark hair and the extremely serious expression of someone who had recently been wronged. Are the trees real? Lily demanded. The trees are very real. I'll show you. Wait. He turned the phone toward the door to the courtyard, panning slowly. Clara could hear the child on the screen making a sound of skeptical assessment. They look fake. They're not fake. They smell like oranges. I can't make you smell them through a phone. You could if you tried harder. I'm going to have to discuss your theory of technology with you when I get home. When are you coming home? A beat. 3 more weeks. A longer silence. Bernard says 3 weeks is too many weeks. Tell Bernard I agree with him. Clara stepped back from the doorway and went upstairs the long way, through the corridor that overlooked the courtyard. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the orange trees in the dark. She thought about Elena Holloway, 3rd-generation Italian-American, who had wanted her daughter to understand that things of real value take generations to build. She thought about a stuffed rabbit named Bernard, who had specific requirements and did not negotiate. She thought about how a person could surprise you, not by becoming someone different, but by being more fully themselves than you'd originally understood. She went to her room. She opened her laptop. She wrote 8 pages of the thesis, the best 8 pages she'd written in 2 years, and fell asleep at her desk at 1 in the morning with her cheek on her notebook and the city of Florence quiet outside the window. The acquisition was 4 days from completion when everything broke apart. It came through Garrett first. A text to Nathan at 6 in the morning that Nathan read standing in the courtyard with his coffee, and Clara knew from the way he went very still that whatever it was serious. She was coming down the stairs when he looked up at her, and something in his expression, the calculation face, back in full force, but underneath it something tight and cold, made her stomach drop before he said a word. Marcus Vale, he said. The name meant nothing to her. He's a competitor. He's been trying to acquire the Ferretti properties for 3 years. He knew we were close. Nathan set down the coffee. Last night he released a financial report to 3 major business publications claiming that Holloway Group has $200 million in undisclosed liabilities and is facing a regulatory investigation for misrepresentation to investors. Clara went still. Is it true? He looked at her. No. Is there any part of it that... No. No hesitation, no qualification, just the flat certainty of someone who knew exactly where all their numbers were. It's fabricated, but it's specific enough that it looks credible, and it's already on the front page of 2 financial news sites, and Aldo's lawyers will have seen it before we have breakfast. As if on cue, Julia called. Nathan answered it, listened for 45 seconds, and said, I understand. Tell your grandfather I'll call him by 9. He hung up. He looked at the orange trees. His jaw was doing the thing she recognized now, the controlled tightness of a man keeping a very large amount of very cold anger somewhere useful. Aldo has suspended the negotiations pending clarification, he said. Pending clarification, she repeated. That's not a no. It's not a yes either. He ran a hand through his hair, the first uncontrolled gesture she'd seen from him. I need to go back to New York. The board is going to need statements. The legal team needs to start the defamation response. My CFO is already fielding calls from 3 institutional investors who saw the story this morning. I can't manage this from here. Clara was quiet for a moment. How long? I don't know. A week, maybe 10 days. Garrett stays here. Priya stays here. He looked at her. I need you to stay here. I know. Aldo trusts you. Whatever relationship exists between us and that family right now, you're most of it. If you leave, there's nothing to come back to. I know, she said again. I'm not leaving. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name, not the calculation face, not the dinner table face. Something in between that she hadn't cataloged yet. This isn't what you signed up for, he said. The contract covers 6 weeks, she said. I'm in week 3. I'm staying. He nodded once. He picked up his phone and started moving. The mobile office reassembling itself in real time, calls being placed, Garrett appearing at the door with a laptop already open, Priya with a stack of printed materials. Clara stepped aside to let the machinery pass. At the door he stopped. He turned back, and for just a moment the machinery wasn't running. Clara. Her name in his mouth, unqualified, no title, no formality, just her name. Thank you. She met his eyes. Go fix it, she said. He left. She stood in the courtyard alone with the orange trees and the cool morning and the particular silence of a crisis in its first hours, before everything that was going to happen had started happening. She thought about $87 and a blinking cursor and a dropped plate and a 6 a.m. email. She thought about how strange it was, the way the path from one place to another was never the path you would have drawn if someone had handed you a map. Then she picked up her phone and called Julia Ferretti. I'd like to have coffee with your grandfather, she said. Today, if he's willing. Just the 2 of us. A pause. He might not want... I know, Clara said. Ask him anyway. Julia called back 14 minutes later. But he says he'll meet you at his house, 10 o'clock. He wants to know if you've been to Fiesole. I haven't. He says he'll show you the view first. He says the view is the argument for everything. Clara looked at the orange trees one more time. Then she went upstairs to get her coat. The road to Fiesole climbed out of Florence in long, unhurried curves. the city falling away below as the car moved higher into the hills. Clara watched it from the passenger seat of Giulia's small Fiat. The terracotta rooftops, the dome of the Duomo sitting above everything else the way it had for 600 years, the Arno catching the morning light in the distance. It was the kind of view that made you understand, viscerally and without argument, why people had been fighting over this city for 1,000 years. Aldo Ferretti's house was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her head, something grand, something appropriate to a man who owned 4 historic hotels and had spent his life among beautiful things. What she found instead was a stone farmhouse that had been added to unevenly over what appeared to be several decades, with a garden that was clearly tended by someone who cared about it and had very specific opinions about where things should go, and a front door that had been painted dark blue and was slightly warped at the bottom, so it scraped the threshold when Giulia pushed it open. Aldo was already in the garden when they arrived. He was standing at the far edge, looking out over the valley, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she'd come to associate with him. He didn't turn when he heard them come through the gate. He waited until they'd walked all the way to him, and then he gestured at the view with one hand, a gesture that said, "Look at this first, talk later." Clara looked. The valley spread below them in the particular clarity of an October morning, the vineyards gone to gold, the olive groves silver green, the farms and villages arranged in the landscape with the organic logic of things that had grown rather than been placed. In the far distance, the hills darkened to blue. It was the kind of view that made words feel slightly embarrassing by comparison. "My father bought this house in 1958, Aldo said, without turning. Before the hotels. Before anything. He bought it because of this." He nodded at the valley. He said that a man who looks at this every morning and doesn't understand what he's responsible to protect is a man who shouldn't be trusted with anything. Clara stood beside him and said nothing for a moment. The morning was cool and very clear. A bird she didn't know the name of was making a sound somewhere in the olive trees. "I owe you an explanation," she said finally, "about what happened this morning with the news reports." "You don't owe me anything," Aldo said. "You didn't write the reports." "No, but I'm the reason you took this meeting today instead of closing the door entirely, and I think that comes with some responsibility." He turned to look at her then. In the morning light, with the valley behind him, he looked older than he did in meeting rooms, or not older exactly, but more accurately aged, the way old things look when you take them out of the artificial environment and put them back in the light they were made for. "What do you want to tell me?" he said. "That the reports are false," she said. "That I've spent 3 weeks in close proximity to this company and this man, and I don't believe what Marcus Vale is claiming. That I know that's not evidence, and I know you have to protect your family's interests, and I'm not asking you to take my word for it. But I'm asking you not to close the door while we wait for the evidence to come through." Aldo was quiet. He looked back at the valley. "You know Marcus Vale?" "I know of him. Nathan mentioned him this morning." "I have known Marcus Vale for 20 years, Aldo said. He said the name the way you say the name of something that has been a problem for a long time and is still a problem. "He has been trying to acquire my family's properties for 7 years. First my father-in-law, then me. He's persistent in the way that water is persistent. Not intelligent, not creative, but constant. He finds the lowest point and he pushes." "This report is the lowest point," Clara said. "Yes." Aldo turned back to her. "I know this. I knew it when my lawyers called me this morning. A man doesn't release a financial scandal report at 5 a.m. unless he's panicking, and Vale is panicking because he knows how close we are." He paused. "This doesn't mean Holloway is clean. It means Vale is frightened. Those are different things." "I understand the distinction. Do you believe Holloway is clean?" Clara looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I've watched him work for 3 weeks. Because he spent an afternoon crouching next to a column joint with you talking about honest restoration. Because when I told him the operational structure for the staff was wrong, he changed it without arguing. Because—" She stopped. "Because the man I've seen in Florence is not a man who needs to falsify financial documents. He's good enough at what he does to not need to cheat." Aldo was quiet for a long time. The bird in the olive trees was still making its sound. The valley lay below them, patient and golden and entirely indifferent to the question of who owned what. "Come inside," Aldo said. "I'll make coffee, the real kind, not what they serve in hotels." The kitchen of the farmhouse was low-ceilinged and smelled like wood and old stone and coffee grounds. A dog Clara hadn't seen yet, old, gray-muzzled, shaped like a footstool, lifted its head from a rug near the door and then put it back down. Aldo moved around the kitchen with the comfort of a man who knew where everything was and had known for 50 years. Julia sat at the table and opened her phone and then, apparently thinking better of it, put it face down. "My wife cooked in this kitchen every Sunday for 43 years, Aldo said, filling the mocha pot. "She died 11 years ago. I haven't changed anything." "The blue door," Clara said. He looked over his shoulder at her. "She painted it, 1987. I thought it was the wrong color. I was wrong." He set the pot on the stove. "You learn these things, usually too late." Julia was looking at her phone again despite herself. Clara watched her expression shift. No, she said. "There's something." Aldo didn't turn from the stove. "Tell me." "A journalist, financial correspondent for the Atlantic Wire. She's published a thread saying the Vail report has inconsistencies. She's identified 3 specific figures that don't match publicly available Holloway Group filings. She's saying the report may be fraudulent." The mocha pot began to make its sound. Aldo stood watching it. "Maybe," he said. "She's asking for a statement from Vail's camp." "They haven't responded yet." "They won't respond," Aldo said. "Not to that. They'll wait and hope it disappears." He picked up the pot and poured 3 cups without measuring, without looking, the way you do something you've done 10,000 times. He set them on the table. He sat down across from Clara. "My father told me a story," he said, "about a man in our village who sold a piece of land twice, to 2 different buyers. In 1951, when everything was uncertain and records were difficult, and people were willing to believe what they were told because they wanted to believe the worst was over." He picked up his cup. "The man was caught because one of the buyers walked the land himself, before the papers were signed, and found a marker that didn't match the description in the contract. A stone boundary marker. The man had moved it." "But he'd left a mark in the ground where it had been," Clara said. "Yes." Aldo looked at her. "There is always a mark where the stone was." She understood what he was telling her. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The real coffee, dark and precise, and nothing like what restaurants served, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest that had been tight since 6 that morning. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet?" He set down his cup. "The door is not closed, but it's not open either. I need to see the mark where the stone was." In New York, Nathan was already looking for it. He'd landed at JFK at 7 a.m. and gone directly to the Holloway Group offices on the 40th floor of a building in Midtown, where his CFO, a former federal financial regulator named Sandra Park, had been there since 4 in the morning with the full accounting team and a wall of monitors that made the room look less like a corporate office and more like a situation room, which was approximately what it was. "Walk me through it," Nathan said before he'd taken off his coat. Sandra handed him a coffee. She knew better than to ask if he wanted one, and turned to the monitors. "The report claims $200 million in undisclosed liabilities structured as off-balance sheet obligations through 3 subsidiary entities. The entities named are Holloway Pacific Holdings, HHG Cayman Trust, and a company called Meridian Venture Partners." "Meridian Venture Partners doesn't exist," Nathan said. "Correct. It doesn't exist in any filing, any registry, any jurisdiction we can find. The other 2 entities are real. The liabilities attributed to them are not." "Where did the numbers come from?" Sandra hesitated, the hesitation of someone who had found something and was choosing how to present it. "That's the interesting part. The figures in the Vail report match, almost exactly, figures from a confidential internal projection document that we prepared in 2021 as part of a scenario analysis. Worst-case financial modeling. What would happen if 3 of our primary properties lost 40% occupancy simultaneously?" Nathan was very still. "That document was never public." "No." "Who had access to it?" internal distribution, finance team, executive team, and she pulled up a list. Legal, for due diligence purposes on the Vancouver acquisition that year. A pause. Vale's current general counsel previously worked for the firm that handled our Vancouver due diligence. The room was quiet except for the ambient sound of 40 floors above Midtown and the hum of the monitors. He had someone on the inside, Nathan said. Not a question. Or access to someone who had access. Sandra clicked to the next screen. This doesn't prove it yet. But it's the mark where the stone was. Nathan looked at the screen. He thought about Aldo Ferretti standing at the edge of his garden in Fiesole, looking at a valley his father had bought a house to see. He thought about Clara in that garden, which he didn't know it had happened yet but would learn about later. He thought about what it cost, what it actually cost, in the human sense rather than the financial one, to build something that was worth stealing from. Get me the full audit trail on that 2021 document, he said. Every access log, every print command, every email that attached it. He turned away from the monitors. And get me Marcus Vale's legal team on a call. They won't take the call, Sandra said. They will, Nathan said, when my lawyers explain to them that we're filing a defamation suit by 5 p.m. unless we have a retraction by 3. Sandra looked at him. We need more evidence before we have enough evidence to file. We'll get the rest during discovery. He set down the coffee. He made a mistake. He used real numbers, our real numbers from our own internal documents, and he thought we wouldn't be able to trace the origin because the numbers themselves are plausible enough. But he didn't understand that plausible isn't the same as accurate, and that every document we've ever generated has a metadata trail. He looked at the monitors. Find me the trail. Sandra turned to the team. The room went into the particular focused motion of people who have a clear task and the skills to execute it. Nathan stepped back out of the way. He was good at this too, at getting out of the way when the right people were working. He'd learned it, but he'd learned it. He went to his office and closed the door and called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. She was still in Fiesole. He could tell from the quality of the silence around her, the outdoor sound of it. How is he? Nathan asked. The door is still open, she said, but he needs to see the evidence, not hear about it, see it. We're building it. How long? Sandra thinks 48 hours to have something airtight. A pause on the line, not an uncomfortable one, the kind where the other person is thinking rather than waiting. Okay, Clara said. I'm having lunch with Julia tomorrow. I'll keep the temperature stable. I know you will. He paused. How was the view? She was quiet for a moment. You should see it. When this is over, you should go up there and look at it. I will. Another pause. He was sitting at his desk, 40 floors above Midtown Manhattan, in the office where he'd made most of the significant decisions of his professional life, and the city was doing its usual thing outside the window. Enormous, indifferent, perpetually in motion. Florence, where Clara was sitting in some farmhouse garden in the hills, was 4,000 miles away. He was aware of this in a way that was slightly more than logistical. Clara, he said. I know, she said, quietly, meaning, I know this is difficult, meaning, I know what's at stake, meaning, possibly, something he wasn't going to examine more closely right now. Go find the trail. He hung up. He went back to the Situation Room. Marcus Vale's response to the lawsuit threat came at 3:47 p.m. Not the retraction Nathan had demanded, but something almost more useful, a statement from Vale's communications team that contained in its third paragraph a specific denial about the sourcing of the report that directly contradicted what Sandra's team had found in the document metadata trail. Nathan read the statement twice. He sent it to Sandra with a single note. He just lied in writing about the thing we have evidence for. Sandra's response came back in 4 minutes. Yes, he did. The 48 hours Nathan had estimated turned into 31. What Sandra's team found buried in the access logs of a file server that the Vancouver legal firm still used for archived client documents was a login at 2 a.m. on a Thursday 6 weeks ago from an IP address registered to a shell company whose registered agent was a man who had previously worked as a fixer for Marcus Vale's family office for 9 years. The login had accessed one folder. The folder contained 3 documents: One of them was the 2021 scenario analysis with the numbers that appeared in the Vail report. The shell company was registered in Delaware. The registered agent had a LinkedIn profile with a 6-month gap in employment that corresponded exactly to the period when he'd left Vail's family office. The gap was explained on the profile as independent consulting. "It's not smoking gun evidence," Sandra said, presenting it to Nathan and the legal team at midnight on the second day. "Not for a criminal case, but for a defamation suit with the statement Vail's team made this afternoon, it's enough to make him retract or watch us go to discovery, where we subpoena everything." "What does counsel say?" Nathan asked. The lead attorney, a compact woman named Ellen Marsh, who had been doing financial litigation for 25 years, looked at her notes. "I say we file tomorrow morning and call for an emergency retraction simultaneously. I say we give Vail's team 2 hours after filing before we send it to every publication that ran the original story. I say we make the cost of not retracting visibly higher than the cost of retracting." Nathan nodded once. "Do it." He called Clara at 12:30 a.m. her time, which was 6:30 a.m. in Florence, the city just beginning to get light. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been awake. "We have it," he said. A pause. Then, "How solid?" "Solid enough to file. Solid enough that Vail's lawyers will tell him to cut his losses." "And the publications that ran the story?" "Ellen is handling it. By noon New York time, which is 6 p.m. your time, anyone who ran it will have a legal letter and a summary of what we've found." He paused. "I want to call Aldo this morning, personally, before the filing goes public." "Yes," Clara said immediately. "You should. Before the news cycle picks it up, before his lawyers call him. He should hear it from you first." "Will he take my call?" "I think so." A pause. "I may have had coffee with him yesterday." "I know. Julia called Garrett." "Of course she did. She said you talked for 3 hours." "We talked about the Umbrian property mostly. The convent. Santa Caterina." A pause. "He told me what the wall looks like now. The one his father rebuilt. He said there are plants growing in the cracks that his father put there on purpose, seeds pushed into the mortar while it was still curing. He wanted something living in it." Nathan was quiet. In his office, midnight New York, the city outside was still doing what it always did. "Seeds in the mortar," he said. He said his father believed that a restoration without life in it was just a replica. Nathan sat with that for a moment. "I want to say something to him this morning beyond the legal situation. I want to—" He stopped. This was not typically a thing he did, stop in the middle of a sentence because he hadn't finished knowing what he meant. "Tell him about Elena," Clara said. He went still. "Tell him why you're really doing this," she said. Her voice was careful, not soft exactly, but considered, like someone placing something fragile on a surface. "Not the business reason. He already knows the business reason. Tell him about Elena wanting Lily to understand what endures. That's what he needs to hear. That's the stone in the mortar." The silence between them lasted several seconds, the kind of silence that wasn't empty. "You figured that out," he said. "In the first week," she said. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't my thing to say." "It still isn't." "No," she agreed. "But you asked." He looked at the window, at the city, at his reflection in the dark glass, which showed him a man who looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fully fix. "How do you know it'll work? With him?" "Because he spent 43 years not changing the kitchen where his wife cooked," Clara said. "He understands exactly what it means to keep something for someone who isn't there anymore." Another silence. "Get some sleep," she said. "You have a call to make in a few hours." He called Aldo Ferretti at 7:30 a.m. Florence time. He called him before the filing went public, before the legal letters went out, before anything that could be described as a tactical move had been made. He called him the way you call someone when the call itself is the point. Aldo answered on the 4th ring. Nathan spoke in Italian. He explained the evidence, clearly without overselling it. He explained what Sandra had found, what the document trail showed, what Vail's statement had done to his own position. He explained the lawsuit and the timeline. He said he understood if Aldo needed to see the documents before making any decisions, and that he would have everything sent to Aldo's lawyers by 9 a.m. And then he stopped explaining things, and he said, in the same language, There's something else I want to tell you. Not as part of the negotiation, just because I think you should know it." Aldo said nothing. He was listening. "My wife," Nathan said, "was Italian-American, third generation. Her grandmother came from Siena. She grew up with Italian in the house, the way some people grow up with a particular smell or a particular kind of light. It was just part of the texture of things." He paused. "She died 3 years ago, when our daughter was 2. Before she died, she told me about the Ferretti properties. She'd read about them somewhere, a magazine or a travel piece, I don't remember. She said, 'When Lily is old enough, take her to places like that. Places where you can feel that the people who built it understood they were building for people they would never meet.'" He stopped again. "I've been in the hospitality industry for 10 years. I've acquired a lot of properties. Some of them I'm proud of, and some of them I'm," he chose the word carefully, "ambivalent about. The Ferretti properties are the first ones in my career where I understood, before we started, what it would mean to get it wrong, and that understanding came from Elena. I wanted you to know that." The line was quiet for a long time. "She was from Siena," Aldo said finally. "Her grandmother, yes." "What was the grandmother's name?" "Rosalia. Rosalia Benedetti, before she married." A pause. A long one. "My mother's cousin married a Benedetti from Siena, 1952. Another pause. "The world is not as large as people think." "No," Nathan said. "It's not." Aldo was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different. Not softer exactly, but the way a room sounds different when a window opens. "Send me the documents," he said. "I'll have my lawyers review them by noon. I'll call you at 2 o'clock. "Thank you, Aldo." "Don't thank me. Let me review the documents." But the way he said it was different from the way he'd said things before. 2 o'clock, he said, and hung up. Nathan sat in his office for a moment after the call ended. Then he texted Clara. He said 2 o'clock, send documents to his lawyers at 9. Her response came back in under a minute. Already told Garrett. Documents are being prepared. He stared at the text for a second longer than necessary. Then he put the phone down and went to find coffee. In Florence, Marcus Vale's representative arrived at Clara's door at 11:15 in the morning. She hadn't known it was coming. She answered the door of the palazzo expecting Julia, who had said she might stop by, and found instead a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, well-dressed in the specific way that communicated money without being able to conceal effort, holding a business card between two fingers with the slightly theatrical precision of someone who had practiced the gesture. "Ms. Bennett," he said in English. "My name is Thomas Reeves. I represent Marcus Vale." She didn't take the card. "How did you know where I was staying?" "Mr. Vale keeps himself informed about the people involved in significant business situations." He smiled, a professional smile, the kind that had been calibrated for maximum non-aggression. "I wonder if I could have a few minutes of your time. A private conversation." Clara looked at him for a moment. The smart thing, the careful thing, would have been to close the door and call Nathan. She knew this. She also knew that she wasn't going to close the door, because closing the door was what people did when they were afraid of what was on the other side of it, and she wanted to know what Marcus Vale thought she was. "I have 10 minutes, she said. She didn't invite him in. They stood in the doorway of the palazzo, which was perhaps not what he'd planned. "Mr. Vale is aware of your significant contribution to the Holloway-Ferretti negotiations," Reeves said. "He's impressed, frankly. It's not an easy thing, building trust with Aldo Ferretti. The man doesn't give it easily." "No," Clara agreed. "He doesn't. Mr. Vale would like to offer you an opportunity." He named a number, a consulting contract, 6 months, at a rate that was nearly 3 times what Nathan was paying her. "Mr. Vale has several European acquisitions in process that would benefit enormously from someone with your cultural fluency and relationship-building skills. The work would start immediately, and it would involve— He wants me to walk away from the Ferretti negotiation," Clara said. Reeves paused. "He wants to offer you a more significant long-term opportunity." "He wants me to walk away from the Ferretti negotiation," she said again, same tone, "and leave Nathan Holloway without the relationship I've spent 3 weeks building, which would effectively end any chance of the acquisition completing, which is what the fraudulent report was supposed to accomplish before the document trail showed up. The professional smile didn't entirely disappear, but it became slightly more structural, held in place rather than generated. "That's not how Mr. Vale would characterize. I'm sure it's not," Claire said. "Mr. Reeves, I want to be very clear with you. I'm not interested in the offer. I'm not interested in a conversation about the offer. I'm not interested in a counteroffer or revised framing of the offer." She looked at him steadily. "And I want you to understand that this conversation will be documented and shared with both Nathan Holloway's legal team and, if appropriate, with the legal correspondence that is currently in preparation regarding the fraudulent report." Reeves's expression went through a small, rapid series of changes. "Ms. Bennett, there's no need to characterize. I'm not characterizing anything. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." She met his eyes. "I grew up without a lot of money. I still don't have a lot of money. I know what it feels like to be offered something that looks like a solution and is actually a transaction. I know the difference between an opportunity and a purchase." She reached out and took the business card. He blinked, slightly surprised, and looked at it. Thomas Reeves, Senior Advisor, Vale Capital Partners. She held it back out to him. "Take this with you. I won't be needing it." He took the card. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer professional, just a man recalibrating something he'd gotten wrong. "You understand you're making a decision that protects my integrity and the people who have trusted me," she said. "Yes, I'm aware." She stepped back. "Goodbye, Mr. Reeves." She closed the door. She stood in the entrance hall of the palazzo for a moment with her hand on the closed door and waited for the shaking to start. It didn't, which surprised her, and then didn't surprise her, because she thought about it and realized the absence of shaking was correct. She'd known what her answer was before he'd finished his first sentence. She hadn't needed to deliberate. She hadn't needed to weigh it against anything. There was nothing on the other side of the scale. She went to the small sitting room and called Nathan. "Someone from Vale's team just came to the door," she said when he picked up. "A man named Thomas Reeves." A short silence. "How did he know where you were staying?" "The same way Vale knows everything, apparently, through being well-resourced and persistent." "What did he want?" "To offer me a consulting contract at 3 times my current rate in exchange for walking away." She sat down in the chair by the window. In the courtyard, the orange trees were doing what orange trees do. Standing there, smelling like themselves, entirely unbothered. "I said no." Nathan was quiet for longer than she expected. "Are you okay?" "Yes." "He didn't threaten you?" "No, he made a business offer. That's different." She looked at the orange trees. "I documented the conversation. I'll write it up and send it to Ellen Marsh." "Clara is, It's fine," she said. "It was actually fine. The whole thing was fine." She paused. "He underestimated me, which is a thing men in nice suits tend to do, and I closed the door on him, which is the appropriate response." Another silence, longer. "I know," Nathan said finally. It was 2 words, but the way he said them, not "I know you're fine," not "I know you're capable," just "I know," with the weight of something that didn't need the rest of the sentence, was different from most things he said. "Go get ready for Aldo's 2 o'clock call," she said. "Yeah." A pause. "Thank you. For what you did, for staying, for—" He stopped. "You already thanked me once," she said. "At the door, when you left." "This is a different thank you." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street beyond the palazzo walls. Somewhere in the city, a bell was ringing the hour. The 11th hour, slow and even, the way Florentine bells had been counting time for centuries. "Go get ready for your call," she said. She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her lap. Then she opened her laptop and started writing the documentation of the Thomas Reeves conversation. Date, time, what was said, what wasn't said, with the same careful attention she gave to her thesis, precise, complete, and without any embellishment that might make it less true. She sent it to Ellen Marsh at 11:52. She received a response at 12:04 that said, "In its entirety, this is exactly what we needed, thank you." At 2 o'clock Florence time, Nathan's call with Aldo lasted 40 minutes. Clara wasn't on it. She was in the kitchen of the palazzo making herself lunch. Actual lunch. Pasta with whatever was in the refrigerator, not the elaborate restaurant meals of the past 3 weeks, when Garrett came in and said, "He's back in." She looked up from the stove. Aldo reviewed the documents. His lawyers confirmed what Sandra found. He's agreed to resume negotiations. Garrett had the expression of a man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a long time and had just been allowed to set it down. Formal meeting tomorrow morning. Both sides. He wants you there. Clara turned back to the stove. She stirred the pasta. She thought about Salvatore Ferretti crouching next to a medieval wall with a trowel and seeds pressed into fresh mortar. The living things he'd put inside the stone for people he'd never meet. "Tell Nathan," she said. "He knows. He's on the phone with his board." Garrett paused in the doorway. "He asked me to tell you first." She looked at the pasta. At the small kitchen of the Florentine palazzo, with its ancient stone walls and its uneven floor and its particular smell of old buildings that had survived everything the centuries had thrown at them. She thought about an $87 bank balance and a blinking cursor and a wet floor in a Manhattan restaurant that maintenance never fixed. She thought about what it meant to stay when it would have been easier and more lucrative and arguably more rational to go. "Okay," she said. "Tell him I'll be ready at 9. Garrett left. Clara drained the pasta. She ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the small window at the courtyard, at the orange trees that Lily Holloway didn't quite believe were real. In 3 weeks, she would be able to show her. She didn't know that yet, but the ember knew. The stubborn, stupid thing that had refused to go out for 11 months. It knew. It was doing something she'd almost forgotten it knew how to do. It was burning warm and steady, like something that had finally found enough air. Nathan flew back to Florence on a red-eye that landed at 6:45 in the morning, 2 days after the 2 o'clock call with Aldo. He hadn't planned to come back this soon. The board still had questions, the legal team still had filings in motion. Sandra was managing 3 separate conversations with institutional investors who'd been spooked by the Vail report and needed steady reassurance. There were good arguments for staying in New York another week and managing the Florence side remotely. He came back anyway. He told himself it was because the formal signing meetings required his physical presence. That was true. He told himself it was because the final negotiation terms needed a principal, not a proxy. That was also true. He didn't examine the other reasons too closely, because the other reasons lived in the same compartment as the Florence courtyard and the orange trees and the quality of the silence on phone calls at 6 a.m., and he'd made a practice of keeping that compartment latched. Clara was already at the palazzo when his car arrived. She was in the courtyard with Julia, the two of them at the stone table with coffee and what appeared to be a spread of documents, legal summaries, Clara's handwritten notes, the architectural survey of the Umbrian property that had been part of the Ferretti due diligence package. She looked up when she heard the car in the entrance, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that she immediately arranged back into professional composure. He noticed. He filed it away in the latched compartment. "You're early," she said. "Flight was on time for once." He set his bag down. He looked at the documents on the table. "Tell me where we are." "Julia has been here since 8, Clara said. And Julia, who had apparently decided somewhere in the past week that being formally polite with Nathan was less efficient than being direct, pushed a summary page across the table at him. "My grandfather wants 3 things added to the final agreement," Julia said. "First, a named cultural preservation officer for each property. Not a title, an actual person with actual authority to halt any renovation that threatens the historic character of the building. Second, a formal consultation process with the existing staff before any operational changes are implemented in the first 2 years. Third," she paused, "Clara." Nathan looked up from the page. "He wants Clara written into the agreement," Julia said, "not as a Holloway employee, as an independent consultant retained specifically to oversee the cultural integrity of the properties. Minimum 3-year commitment, quarterly visits, direct reporting line to both you and to whoever we designate on the family side." Nathan set the page down. He looked at Clara. She was looking at the coffee in front of her with the careful expression of someone who had known this was coming and had decided to let it land without helping it or hindering it. That was his condition, Nathan said, not a request. He was very clear about the distinction, Julia said. Nathan picked up the page again. He read it. He set it down again. I have no objection to any of this, he said. 0 objections. The named preservation officer should have been in the original draft. The staff consultation process is correct. And Clara... He stopped. He looked at her. Clara should have been in the agreement from the beginning. Clara looked up then, met his eyes. You didn't know I existed from the beginning. No, he said. That's accurate. He picked up the coffee that Julia slid toward him. She'd apparently decided he needed one, and sat down at the stone table. Tell me what else. They worked through the morning. The 4 of them, then Garrett joining at 10, then a lawyer from the Ferretti family's firm who arrived at 11 with a revised term sheet that was, to everyone's visible relief, not dramatically different from the previous one. The additions Julia had outlined were the significant changes. Everything else was refinement. Clara managed the room with the same quality that Nathan had watched her use since the first meeting with Aldo. Not managing in the obvious sense, not directing or mediating with visible effort, but holding the temperature steady, noticing when something needed to slow down and slowing it, noticing when something needed to move and moving it. She spoke Italian when Aldo's lawyer needed the precision of it, switched to English when Garrett needed to follow the thread, and at one point spent 15 minutes with a single paragraph in the term sheet, discussing the meaning of the word custodian versus steward in the context of what the Ferretti family actually needed to hear about how their properties would be treated. Custodian means keeping something safe for someone else, she explained to Nathan afterward, in the brief window between the morning session and lunch. Steward means actively tending to it. Aldo needs to hear steward. The responsibility is different. Change it, Nathan said. Already done. I told Garrett at 9:30. He looked at her. You told Garrett before you told me. You were on the phone with Sandra at 9:30. Still, do you want me to tell you things I've already handled before I tell the people who need to handle them? No, he admitted. That would be inefficient. Good. She picked up her notes. Aldo wants to do a walkthrough of the Siena property tomorrow. Villa Ferretti, the original one. He hasn't asked for a business meeting in the context of the walkthrough. He just wants to walk through it. With you. Just me? You and me, she said. He was specific. Nathan thought about the Fiesole garden, which Clara had described in pieces across several phone calls. The view, the coffee, the blue door, the dog. He thought about what Clara had said. Tell him about Elena. He thought about the 2-minute silence on the phone after he'd said Elena's grandmother was Rosalia Benedetti from Siena. The world is not as large as people think. All right, he said. Villa Ferretti. What time? 9 in the morning. He wants to be there when the light is right. She said this without irony because Aldo Ferretti had said it without irony, and she'd understood immediately what he meant. Villa Ferretti sat on a hill outside Siena in the way that very old things sit in the Tuscan landscape, not placed on it but grown from it, as if the building and the hill had arrived at their current arrangement through a long mutual negotiation that neither party entirely remembered anymore. The stone was the color of the land around it. The cypresses that lined the entrance road had been there since before the building had been a hotel, before it had been a German command post, before it had been a family estate, and before that, probably, other things that nobody was still alive to remember. Aldo was waiting at the entrance when their car arrived. He was in his dark suit again. The same one, Clara thought, or one identical to it. And he was standing on the steps with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the valley below with the expression she'd come to read as, I am thinking about time. He greeted Nathan with a handshake that was also slightly something more, the handshake of a man who had made a decision and was enacting it physically. He greeted Clara by nodding at the valley and saying in Italian, The light is right. It was. The morning light in the hills outside Siena in October did things that Clara had no adequate vocabulary for and had stopped trying to describe, which was either a failure of language or evidence that some things were correctly beyond it. They walked through the property for 2 hours. Aldo knew every room, not in the way a business owner knows a property. He knew it the way you know something you grew up inside of, where the knowledge lives in the body rather than the memory. He knew which stair creaked and on which side. He knew that the window in the east-facing breakfast room had been replaced in 1987 and that the new frame was slightly the wrong proportion and that it had bothered him for 37 years. He knew that the wine cellar had been dug by his grandfather in 1931 and that the walls down there sweated in August and that you had to account for it in the storage system. He told Nathan all of this. Nathan listened, really listened, not the performance of listening, but the thing itself, his phone in his pocket and his attention in the room. He asked questions that weren't business questions. How had they handled the east window eventually? Had they tried to fix it or accepted it? What was the wine cellar's drainage solution? Had it always worked? The questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand a building rather than assess it. Clara walked slightly behind them for most of the tour. She was there when she was needed and quiet when she wasn't, which was a thing she'd learned about her role here, that her function was not to be continuously visible but to be correctly placed. When Aldo switched to a Tuscan dialect so thick that Nathan's Italian started to strain, she was there to catch it without making Nathan feel caught. When Nathan mentioned, in passing, something about Lily wanting to see the wine cellars, she has a theory that wine comes from underground magic. I haven't corrected her yet. And Aldo's face did something complicated and gentle. Clara was there to let the moment be what it was without filling it. They ended up in the garden at the back of the villa, which looked east toward hills that were so old they'd stopped being impressive and become simply true. There was a stone bench under an olive tree that Aldo clearly knew well, because he sat on it with the ease of a man returning to a specific chair in his own house. Nathan and Clara sat on a low wall nearby. Aldo looked at the hills for a while. Then he said, in Italian, not looking at either of them, "My father sat on this bench the morning the last hotel opened, the Umbrian one, Santa Caterina. He took the train back here, and he sat here, and he looked at those hills, and he said to me, 'Aldo, now I can die in order.'" He paused. He was 67 years old. He died 11 months later. His heart, Nathan, was quiet. He meant that he had done what he came to do, Aldo said. Not that he was finished. He never thought he was finished. He meant that the order of things was correct, that the things that needed to exist now existed. He turned to look at Nathan directly. "I need to know that I can sit on this bench in 10 years and say the same thing, that the order is correct, that what my father built still exists in a form he would recognize." "It will," Nathan said. "How can you promise that? You are one man. Companies change. People change." "I can't promise the company won't change," Nathan said. "I won't make that promise because it would be dishonest, and you'd know it was dishonest. What I can promise is that the people I put in place will have authority to say no. Real authority. The preservation officer in the contract, that person answers to me and to your family simultaneously. They can halt a renovation. They can veto a rebranding. They can pick up the phone and call me directly, and I will take the call." He paused. "And Clara will be there every quarter, looking at what we're doing with the same eyes she's looked at it with for the past 3 weeks. Those eyes?" He stopped, then continued more quietly. "Those are the right eyes for this." Aldo looked at Clara. Clara met his look. "I won't let it drift," she said, in Italian, directly. "I don't know how to promise more than that, but I can promise that." Aldo was quiet for a long time. The olive tree above him moved slightly in a wind Clara couldn't quite feel from where she was sitting. The hills were the hills. "My father's name was Salvatore," Aldo said. "It means savior. He used to say it was a ridiculous name for a man who only knew how to fix walls." A pause. "He fixed 4 of them, the walls of 4 buildings that are still standing. I think that is enough saving for one life." He stood up from the bench. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Nathan with the expression Clara had learned to read as his version of decided. "We sign on Friday," he said. "Here, in this room." He gestured at the villa behind them. "Not in a lawyer's office. Here." "Here," Nathan agreed. Aldo nodded once. He looked at the hills one more time. Then he walked back toward the villa, unhurried, the way a man walks through a place that belongs to him and always will, regardless of what the papers say. Nathan and Clara stayed on the wall for a moment after he was gone. "Here," Nathan said quietly, still looking at the hills. "Here," Clara said. They didn't say anything else, but neither of them moved for a minute, sitting on the stone wall under the Tuscan sky with the old hills in front of them, and it was one of those silences that had a shape to it. Not empty, not waiting, just present in the way that some moments are present before you fully understood what they are. The signing happened on Friday morning in the front salon of Villa Ferretti, with the east-facing windows and the slightly wrong proportions that had bothered Aldo for 37 years, and the light coming in at the angle that made the room look exactly as old as it was. The lawyers were there. Garrett was there. Julia was there, sitting beside her grandfather with her hands flat on the table, the posture of someone who had prepared for this for a long time. Clara sat at the end of the table with the Cultural Heritage Consultant Addendum in front of her, which she would sign separately after the main agreement. Aldo read every page, all 43 of them. He read slowly, with reading glasses he produced from his breast pocket, and the room waited without impatience because the room understood that this was not a thing to be rushed. When he reached the end, he held his pen above the signature line for a moment and looked at the page. "My father signed a paper like this once," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. 1962. The deed to Villa Ferretti, when he bought it back from the estate of the man who'd bought it during the war. He paid 4 times what it was worth because he needed the family who'd sold it to feel respected, not robbed." He looked at Nathan across the table. "He always said, the number in the contract matters less than what the number says about who you believe yourself to be." "What number did he pay?" Nathan asked. "An impossible number." A dry, small smile. The first fully warm smile Clara had seen from Aldo Ferretti in 3 weeks. "He paid it in installments for 9 years. My mother kept the payment book. I have it in a drawer at home." He signed the paper. Nathan signed. The lawyers signed their sections. The room exhaled in the collective way that rooms exhale when something that has been in motion for a long time finally arrives. Clara signed the addendum. Julia witnessed it. Aldo looked at her signature and said, in Italian, "Good handwriting. My father always said you could judge a person's character by how they wrote their name." "What does mine say?" Clara asked. He looked at it for a moment. "That you know what you're agreeing to," he said, which was, she thought, the best thing he could have said. The celebration that evening was not what Garrett had initially planned, which had involved a private room at a 3-star restaurant in Siena and a wine list that had been pre-approved by the company's sommelier. What happened instead was that Aldo invited everyone to his farmhouse in Fiesole, the stone house with the blue door and the old dog, where his housekeeper, a woman named Renata, who had apparently been cooking for Aldo since before Julia was born, had prepared enough food for twice the number of people present and seemed mildly disappointed it wasn't more. They ate at the long table in the kitchen Aldo hadn't changed in 11 years, and the wine was from the Ferretti family's own vineyard, which was not for sale and had not been part of any negotiation, and the food was the kind of food that didn't have a name on a menu because it was just what Renata knew how to make, and it was the best meal Clara had eaten in years, possibly ever. Garrett, who Clara had spent 3 weeks reading as purely operational, turned out to have very specific feelings about Umbrian cuisine, which he expressed with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including apparently himself. Priya discovered that Julia had studied law at the same university in Rome where Priya's cousin had studied engineering, a coincidence that they spent 45 minutes excavating for mutual acquaintances with the focused delight of people who enjoy this particular game. Aldo's old dog relocated from the rug by the door to under the table, where it became apparent he had been doing this for years, and that Renata knew and disapproved and had made peace with both facts. Nathan sat across from Clara for most of the evening. They talked about the properties, about the next steps, about the names of the preservation officers they'd need to identify, and the timeline for the first post-acquisition review. Business conversation, the kind they'd been having for 3 weeks. But it was looser than it had been. The contracts were signed, and the crisis was resolved, and the Fiesole farmhouse kitchen had the particular quality of a place where people had been eating and talking for decades, and it did something to the temperature of the room that made the conversation drift, the way conversation drifts when the pressure is off and the wine is good. He told her about the Vancouver hotel, the first one, the one he'd mortgaged his apartment to buy, more than he'd told her before. About the week after he bought it, when the HVAC system failed completely and he'd spent 4 days living in the building while he found the money to fix it, eating from the vending machine in the lobby because he couldn't afford to go anywhere else. I was 26, he said. I'd just bet everything I had on a 100-year-old hotel with a broken heating system. I sat in the lobby at 2 in the morning eating peanut butter crackers and thinking, what is wrong with you? What made you do it? She asked. The bones, he said. The building had the right bones. I knew I could fix the heating. You can't fix bones. Clara looked at him across the table. The kitchen was warm and the wine was good, and Aldo at the far end of the table was telling Garrett something that was making Garrett laugh in a way Clara had never heard him laugh before, unguarded, surprised at himself. The bones, she said. You know what I mean? I do, she said. It's the same thing as my thesis. You're looking at what was built to last and identifying the structure underneath the surface condition. She turned her wine glass by the stem, a habit she had when she was thinking. My thesis supervisor told me when I first started that the best historical analysis is essentially structural engineering. You're trying to find what holds the weight. What holds the weight in the Ferretti properties? The continuity, she said. The fact that the same family made every decision for 160 years. The buildings hold the weight because the decisions that shaped them were all made by people who knew they'd have to live with the consequences. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Most companies can't say that. No. Most companies are too big and too fast. The accountability gets diffused. She set down the wine glass. That's what Aldo was actually afraid of. Not that you'd change the buildings, that you'd make decisions too fast for anyone to be accountable for them. And now? And now there are mechanisms, she said. The preservation officer, the staff consultation process, me. She paused. The bones are still there. We've just added accountability around them. He was looking at her with the expression she still hadn't found a name for. The one that wasn't the calculation face and wasn't the dinner table face and was something she'd started to think of privately as the unlatched face. The one that appeared when the management systems had been running long enough and hard enough that something slipped through. Your thesis, he said. How close are you? She blinked. What? You told me you were 40 pages from finished. That was 6 weeks ago. You've been in Florence. Have you been working on it? She looked at him. You remembered that. I remember most things you tell me. She picked up the wine glass again. I'm about 20 pages from finished, she said. Give or take. What happened to the other 20? Florence happened. She said it simply. Being here happened? Writing 12 pages in 3 days in the first week happened. Because being near the primary sources does something to the actual thinking, even when you're not in the archives. She looked at the kitchen wall, the old stone, the hanging copper pots that were too heavy to have been moved in 40 years. I wrote 8 pages the night of the Thomas Reeves visit. I don't know exactly why. Probably because saying no to something that would have been convenient was clarifying. Clarifying how? She considered. You make a decision and it shows you something about what you actually believe, what you actually value. She met his eyes. The writing came out of that. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly enough that the table noise around them absorbed it. What do you actually value, Clara? It was a direct question. It surprised her. Not because he didn't ask direct questions. He did, constantly, but because this one wasn't business. It was the kind of question people asked each other in kitchens, at the end of long evenings when the contracts were signed, and the food was finished and the wine had done its work. She thought about it honestly, which was what the question deserved. Work that means something, she said. Not work that matters to other people, work that I can look at and know it's true. The thesis. This, what we've been doing here, things that are actually about something. She paused. And people. I value people who don't pretend to be easier than they are. That's a narrow category, he said. Most of the good categories are. He held her look for a moment. Then he said, "You should finish the thesis." "I intend to." "I mean, use the time. After this. Take the access you've built here, the relationship with Aldo, the time in the archives if you need it. The Ferretti family has documents going back to the 15th century. Aldo has offered the family archive to the preservation officer. If that's you, it is me. Then you have access." He said it like it was simple, because to him it was. Like a door had been standing there, and he just noticed it and was pointing it out. Clara felt something move in her chest. Not the ember exactly, something adjacent to it. Something that recognized the gesture for what it was. Not charity, not generosity performed for an audience, but the specific act of a person who had seen what someone needed and moved the obstacle without making it a transaction. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said. "You built the access. I'm pointing at it." She almost smiled. "You're pointing at it quite deliberately." "Yes," he said. "I am." The evening ended slowly, the way good evenings in old kitchens end. Not with a clean conclusion, but with a gradual unwinding, people finding their coats. Renata beginning to clear the table with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Aldo's dog migrating back to the rug by the door with the air of someone who had done their social duty and could now be off the clock. Aldo walked everyone to the blue door and shook hands and kissed cheeks with the ceremony of a man who took leave-taking seriously. At the door, he held Clara's hand for a moment after the handshake. "You'll come back," he said. In Italian, not a question. "Every quarter," she said. "As agreed." "Not as agreed," he said. "Come back because this is worth coming back to." He looked at her for a moment with those 81-year-old eyes that had seen enough to have stopped needing to perform anything. "You know the difference?" "Yes," she said. "I do." He let go of her hand. He nodded at Nathan. "Bring the child," he said. "The one with opinions about trees. I want her to see the cellar." "She'll love the cellar," Nathan said. "She'll want to live in it." "Good," Aldo said. "That's the correct response to a good cellar." They walked down to the cars in the cool Fiesole night. The city spread below them in its ancient grid of light. Garrett and Priya went in the first car. Julia hugged Clara in the way she'd started to hug her, like they were friends rather than professional adjacents, and went in her own car. Nathan and Clara stood for a moment at the second car, the driver discreetly looking elsewhere. "Long 6 weeks," he said. "The longest," she said. They were standing close enough that the space between them had the quality of something considered rather than accidental. She was aware of it. She thought he probably was too. "I need to go back to New York next week," he said. "Board follow-up. The institutional investors, a property review in Seattle that got pushed twice." "I know. I want you to come to New York." He said it without preamble, without the careful framing of business necessity, just directly. "Not for a meeting. I want—" He paused. In the dark, with Florence below them, his face had the unlatched look. "I want you to meet Lily, properly, not through a phone screen." Clara was quiet for a moment. "She already knows about you," he said. "I didn't plan it that way. I was on the phone with her one evening, and she asked who I was talking to all the time, and I said a woman named Clara who was helping me with the Italian hotels, and she said—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that was close to the courtyard, almost smile, but had more feeling in it. She said, "Does she know about Bernard?" Clara looked at him. "What did you say?" I said, "Actually, yes, she does." The city below them went about its business. The lights on the Arno, the dome of the Duomo lit against the dark sky, the hills around it holding everything they'd always held. Clara had stood in this view at different times over the past 3 weeks, and it had done the thing it always did, the thing she couldn't describe. But standing in it now was different. It had a different quality of present. "I want to meet Lily," she said. Quietly, directly, because he had been direct and it deserved that. He nodded. Just once. Something in his posture shifted. Not relaxed, he was never fully relaxed, but something in it became less managed, more his. "Good," he said. They got in the car. The driver took them back down the hill toward Florence, and neither of them spoke much, But the silence had the same quality it had in the garden at Villa Ferretti. Shaped, not empty, present. In the 3 days before they flew back to New York, the work of the aftermath began. The transition documents, the initial preservation officer interviews, the property management reviews, the first of what would become many conversations between Clara and the Ferretti Family Archive's designated librarian, a 70-year-old man named Franco who had cataloged every document in the family's possession and who turned out to share Clara's specific interest in Florentine economic history, and who, when she told him about her thesis, went immediately to a filing cabinet and produced a letter dated 1487 that was tangentially but significantly relevant to her third chapter, and that she had not known existed, and that made her grip the edge of the table to keep herself composed. She told Nathan about the letter that evening. He didn't understand the full significance of it. She'd have to explain, and she did, and he listened with the full attention quality that she still wasn't entirely accustomed to, and when she finished, he said, "So Franco just handed you a primary source." "Franco handed me a primary source that changes the framing of a chapter I've been stuck on for 8 months. Then we have to keep Franco very happy. I was planning on it." She looked at the photograph she'd taken of the letter. She couldn't take the letter itself, obviously, but Franco had allowed photography, and she'd taken 11 photos from 11 angles. It's a letter from a cloth merchant to his business partner about a commission for a private chapel. It mentions 3 artists. One of them I've written about extensively. One of them I've written about in passing. The third one, she stopped. "The third one?" he prompted. "The third one I've never encountered before, in any source, not once." She looked up from the photograph, which either means he was extremely minor and I've just found one of the only records of him, or it means there are other records out there and I've been looking in the wrong places. "Which do you think?" "I think both might be true," she said. "I think he might be minor and I might have been looking in the wrong places." Nathan looked at her, looking at the photograph. "You're going to be here a lot," he said, "with the quarterly visits and the archive." "Probably." "The thesis is going to get finished." "Probably," she said again. "Then, yes, it's going to get finished." He didn't say anything to that, but he was quiet in the way of someone who had heard something good and was letting it be good without cluttering it with words. The night before their flight back to New York, Clara went to the window of her room and looked out at the courtyard for a long time. The orange trees were the same as they'd always been, standing there, smelling like themselves, indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 6 weeks and completely unbothered by their role in it. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, 3 weeks and a different lifetime ago, with the contract in her bag and the $87, $301, now $15,000 and change, in her account, and the ember that had refused to go out. She thought about Aldo reading 43 pages at the signing table, about Franco and the letter from 1487, about the look on Nathan's face in the Fiesole night when she'd said, "I want to meet Lily." She thought about what Aldo had said at the Blue Door, "Come back because this is worth coming back to." She thought about the thesis, 20 pages, give or take, about the column joint in the entrance hall that the architects had left visible because it was more truthful, about seeds pressed into fresh mortar while it was still curing by a man who wanted something living in the wall for people he'd never meet. She thought about a dropped plate on a wet floor in a Manhattan restaurant, and an Italian insult, and a 6 a.m. email, and a diner in Astoria with a plastic flower and terrible coffee, and a conversation across a laminate table that had felt, even in the moment, like something starting. She was tired. The good kind. The tiredness that came from work that had actually been work, from days that had actually been full, from being used correctly and using herself correctly in return. She went to bed. She slept without the math problem. For the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she slept clean through without the numbers rearranging themselves in the dark, without the calculating and recalculating that had been the background noise of her life for years. In the morning, she packed her bag, put her thesis notes in her carry-on where she could reach them on the plane, and went downstairs to find Nathan already in the courtyard with his coffee and his phone, except the phone was in his pocket, and the coffee was in both hands, and he was looking at the orange trees with the expression of a man who was looking at something he was going to remember. "Ready?" she asked. He turned to look at her. The morning light was doing the thing that morning light did in Florence, the specific quality that Clara had long since stopped trying to describe. In it, Nathan Holloway looked like himself. Not the version from the restaurant or the boardroom or the crisis management situation room, just himself. A man who had lost something important and built something significant and was standing in a courtyard in Florence looking at trees his daughter didn't believe were real. Almost, he said. He looked back at the trees for one more moment. Then he picked up his bag. Let's go home. She followed him through the entrance hall, past the restored frescoes and the uneven plaster and the column with the honest joint, and out into the Florentine morning where a car was waiting to take them to the airport and then to New York, where a 5-year-old girl and a stuffed rabbit named Bernard were going to have opinions about everything that came next. New York in November was cold in the specific way that New York gets cold. Not the clean, open cold of somewhere with space around it, but the compressed wind tunnel cold of a city that takes weather and concentrates it between buildings until it has opinions. Clara had forgotten, in 6 weeks of Florentine October, that this was what home felt like. She remembered it at the arrivals exit of JFK when the wind came off the parking structure and hit her directly in the face with what felt like personal intent. She took the subway back to Astoria. Nathan had offered the car, not pointedly, not as a performance of resource, just practically, the way he made most practical offers. And she'd said no, because the subway was hers and the apartment was hers, and she needed to go back to her own life for a day before she figured out what her own life was now. He'd understood, or he'd said he understood, and she believed him. The apartment was the same. Of course it was the same. She'd been gone 6 weeks, not 6 years, but it had the quality of a place that had waited for her and was now quietly registering the fact that she'd come back different. The desk with the thesis, the window looking at the bicycle on the fire escape across the alley, the small kitchen, the particular angle of the afternoon light through the east-facing window that she'd lived with for 3 years and had never properly noticed until she'd spent 6 weeks in a city where the light was famous for doing things to people. She put her bag down. She made tea. She sat at the desk and opened the thesis document and looked at the 40 pages, 20 now, she'd told Nathan, give or take, that stood between her and the end of something she'd been carrying for 4 years. She read what she'd written the night of the Thomas Reeves visit. It was good. It was the best she'd written in the entire document, and she knew it wasn't because she was a better writer that night than any other night. It was because she'd made a decision that had shown her what she actually believed, and the writing had come directly out of that clarity, and that was the lesson she'd spent 4 years trying to learn academically and had finally absorbed by living it. She wrote 6 pages that afternoon. She called Yolanda at 7. "How was it?" Yolanda said, and the way she said it, careful, like she was carrying it, told Clara that Yolanda had been thinking about how to ask this question for 6 weeks. "Complicated," Clara said. "Good. Both of those things simultaneously." "And him?" Clara looked at the window. The bicycle on the fire escape had a new lock on it. Someone had finally decided to take the security of their fire escape bicycle seriously. "Also complicated. Also good." A pause. Yolanda, who had known Clara for 6 years and had the particular skill of knowing when to push and when to simply be present, chose present. "Are you okay?" "I think I'm better than okay," Clara said. "I think I'm in that specific phase where things have changed, but you haven't fully processed how yet. It's not bad. It's just a lot to sort through." "Do you need to sort through it out loud?" "Not tonight." She picked up her tea. "Tonight I'm going to sit with it and write more thesis. But thank you." "Clara," Yolanda said, "I'm glad it was good." "Me too," she said. She wrote 4 more pages before midnight, 10 pages in 1 day, the most she'd ever written. She went to sleep knowing the thesis would be finished before the end of the month, which was a fact about her life that she hadn't been able to say with any honesty for almost 2 years. Nathan called the next morning at 8:15, which was earlier than professional and later than personal, and she picked up at the second ring. "There's a complication," he said. Not hello, not good morning, just the thing, directly, which she'd come to recognize as his way of respecting her time. "Vale's team has filed a countersuit. It's frivolous, and Ellen says it'll be dismissed in 6 weeks, but it means the next month is going to be loud." "How loud?" Coverage in the financial press. Probably the regular press. The original video is still circulating. Someone rewrote the Wikipedia article about me 3 times in the past month, and the PR team has been managing it. The countersuit will pull it all back up. Clara set down her tea. She thought about what loud meant, specifically. They're going to write about me again. Probably, as context for who I am and how the acquisition happened. Your name is in the agreement. The consultant addendum is a public document once the acquisition closes next week. She sat with that for a moment. A year ago, 6 months ago, this would have been terrifying. The idea of being legible to the world is connected to a story like this. The exposure of having her name in a document that journalists would read. But what she felt now was something different and more manageable than terror. Wariness, maybe. The intelligent wariness of someone who understood what public attention cost and was choosing to manage it rather than avoid it. I'll talk to your PR team, she said. Kat, I want a statement of my own, not through your communications department, my own, about my role and what the work was. I'm not letting someone else narrate my part of this. A beat. That's the correct call, he said. I know it is. I'll have Rebecca send you her contact who handles independent communications for people adjacent to company news. She's good. Okay. Clara picked up the tea again. What else? I want you to come to dinner on Saturday, at the house. A pause. The particular quality of pause she'd learned to read as him choosing words more carefully than usual. Lily has been asking about the woman from the Italian hotels since I got home. She asked me if you knew what a medieval dungeon smelled like. I told her you were an expert in Italian history, and apparently that's what she took from it. Clara felt something warm move through her chest. What did you tell her? I said I wasn't sure, but that you'd probably know someone who did. A pause. Come to dinner. Saturday, she said. Yes. She spent the rest of the week working. The thesis, the communications consultant Nathan had connected her to. A brisk, practical woman named Josephine, who looked at Clara's situation with the expression of someone examining a math problem they found genuinely interesting, and the first draft of her quarterly review framework for the Ferretti properties, which she'd promised Julia would be ready before the acquisition closed. The statement Josephine helped her draft was 3 paragraphs. It described her educational background, her role in the acquisition as an independent cultural heritage consultant, and the terms of her ongoing engagement with the Ferretti properties. It did not mention the restaurant. It did not mention the video. It did not explain or justify or apologize for anything. It simply described what she did and what she had done, in language that was precise and professionally warm, and Josephine said it was the best client statement she'd worked on in 2 years, which Clara thought was probably generous but chose to accept anyway. She submitted her thesis to Professor Mehta on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after returning from Florence. She sat at her desk afterward for a long time without doing anything. The cursor wasn't blinking in the document anymore because the document was finished and she'd closed it. The desk was the same desk. The window was the same window. The bicycle across the alley was still on the fire escape, still with the new lock. She didn't feel the way she'd imagined she'd feel. She'd had a vague idea, somewhere in the back of the past 4 years, that finishing would feel like arrival, like stepping through a door into a room where things were resolved. What it actually felt like was quieter than that, like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight and feeling the absence of it in your shoulders before you fully registered that you'd put it down. She texted Nathan. Thesis submitted. His response came in 40 seconds. Good. Saturday, 7 o'clock. Bring nothing. She almost smiled at the phone. Nathan Holloway's house on the Upper East Side was not what Clara had built in her head, which was a monument to its own impressiveness, the kind of place that existed to communicate something about the person who lived there. What it actually was a brownstone, 4 floors, on a tree-lined block that had the particular quality of old New York money, which was quieter and more specific than new money, that had clearly been lived in by someone who prioritized function over statement. There were children's drawings in frames in the entrance hall, which stopped her completely for a moment. Not decorative art purchased to look like children's drawings, Actual drawings, in crayon and marker, mounted with the same care as the landscapes on the adjacent wall. "Those are lilies," said a voice, and Clara turned to find a small person standing at the top of the stairs in pajamas, at 7:15 on a Saturday evening, regarding her with the comprehensive assessment of someone who had not yet learned to be subtle about looking at people. Lily Holloway was 5 years old and had her father's dark eyes, and what appeared to be her own entirely individual approach to everything else. She had a stuffed rabbit tucked under her left arm, gray, very worn, with one ear slightly longer than the other from years of being held in specific ways. Bernard, obviously. "Those are good drawings," Clara said, looking back at the frames. "The one with the orange tree. Is that from Florence?" Lily came down 3 steps. "Daddy sent me a picture. Of a tree. I drew it." "It looks right," Clara said. "The proportions are very accurate for a 5-year-old. Lily came down 2 more steps. "I'm almost 6. "Even more impressive, then." Another step. She was studying Clara with the directness of a child who hadn't yet built the social layer that most adults use to mediate their actual reactions. "Do you know what a medieval dungeon smells like?" Clara looked up at her. "I know a man who does. His name is Franco. He's the archivist for a very old family in Italy. He's been in basements that are 600 years old." Lily's eyes went slightly wider. "What did he say it smelled like?" "Old stone and thyme," Clara said, "and apparently, faintly, of the herbs that the people who lived there used to keep on the floors instead of carpets." Lily sat down on the step she was currently on and appeared to be processing this at length. "Why did they have herbs on the floors?" "To make the room smell better. Floors in the Middle Ages were not—" Clara paused. "Floors in the Middle Ages were complicated." "Complicated how?" Nathan appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked down at his daughter sitting on the step and at Clara in the entrance hall, and the expression on his face was the unlatched one, but softer than she'd seen it before. Undone at the edges in a way that was specific to this house, this child, this moment. "Lily," he said, "Clara just got here." "I know," Lily said, not looking up from Clara. "We're talking about floors." "Medieval floors," Clara said, looking up at Nathan. "It's fine. I like the topic." He came down the stairs. He passed Lily, who grabbed his hand briefly as he passed in the way children do. Not to stop him, just to make contact, to confirm he was there, and then let go. He reached the bottom and stood in the entrance hall with Clara, close enough that she could read the full version of his expression, which was, "I'm glad you're here, and I'm not going to perform not being glad about it." "Come in," he said. "Dinner's almost ready. Mrs. Okafor is cooking. She refuses to let anyone else cook in this kitchen on Saturdays." "Who's Mrs. Okafor?" "She's been taking care of this household since Lily was 2 months old," he said. "She has opinions about everything and is correct about most of them." Mrs. Okafor turned out to be a Nigerian woman in her 60s with the bearing of someone who had decided very early in life that efficiency was a form of respect and had never seen any reason to revise this. She received Clara in the kitchen with a handshake and a direct assessment that lasted approximately 3 seconds, and then was apparently resolved, because she handed Clara a glass of wine and told her to sit at the kitchen table, which was where the actual life of the house happened, and went back to what she was doing. "She likes you," Nathan said quietly, sitting across from Clara. "How can you tell?" "She gave you the kitchen table. The dining room is where she puts people she's polite to." The dinner was the kind that people make when they cook things they actually know how to cook rather than things they're trying to cook. Jollof rice and slow-braised chicken and fried plantains and a salad that nobody touched because the other things were too good. Lily ate with the focused efficiency of a child who had strong feelings about plantains and ate 4 of them before anyone could establish a more equitable distribution. She asked Clara 17 questions over the course of dinner, which Clara had counted by the time the plates were cleared, covering medieval dungeons, ongoing, whether Italy had different kinds of old buildings than New York, yes, whether Franco the archivist had ever found a skeleton, Clara didn't know and said so honestly, whether the orange trees in Florence smelled different from oranges you bought in a store, yes, significantly, and whether Clara had ever been lost in a foreign country. "Once," Clara said, "in Venice, I took a wrong turn near the Rialto and ended up in a neighborhood where none of the streets seemed to go in the direction they looked like they were going." "What did you do?" I sat down on a doorstep and looked at a map until I understood where I was. Lily considered this. Daddy gets lost, and he just keeps walking. I don't get lost, Nathan said. You got lost in the parking garage in Vermont. That was a navigation system failure. You said a bad word, Lily said informatively to Clara. Twice. That's between me and the parking garage, Nathan said. Clara looked at her wine glass to keep her expression manageable. After dinner, Lily was talked into bed with a negotiation that involved 3 pages of a chapter book, 1 glass of water, the confirmation that Bernard was in the correct position on the left side of the pillow, and Clara answering 1 more question from the doorway. Will you come back? With yes, which she said without deliberating because the answer was true and immediate and didn't require deliberation. She heard Nathan's voice continuing in the room as she went back downstairs, low and steady, finishing the chapter. She sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Okafor, who was washing the pots in the manner of someone who washed pots as a meditative practice, and drank the rest of her wine. She doesn't usually talk that much to new people, Mrs. Okafor said, without turning from the sink. She has good questions, Claire said. She's been asking about you since her father came home from Italy. A pause. He talked about you. Clara set down the wine glass. What did he say? Mrs. Okafor turned off the tap. She dried her hands on a cloth and looked at Clara with an expression that was not unkind and was also completely without illusion. He said, "There's someone I want Lily to meet," and then he told me about the restaurant and the contract and the negotiation in Italy, all of it. She folded the cloth. He doesn't talk about people. In 5 years, I have heard him talk about business, and I have heard him talk about Lily. I have not heard him talk about a person the way he talked about you. Clara sat with that for a moment. I'm not telling you what to do with that information, Mrs. Okafor said. I'm telling you because you should have it. She put the cloth on the counter and picked up her bag from the hook by the door. Good night, Clara. You know where the door is? She left. The kitchen was quiet. Clara sat at the table for a moment longer, in the kitchen where the actual life of the house happened, in the house with children's drawings in frames in the entrance hall and a parking garage story and a stuffed rabbit with specific pillow requirements. Nathan came downstairs at 8:45. He looked slightly more tired than he had at dinner, the tiredness that came from the specific work of putting a child to bed, which Claire was coming to understand was its own category of effort, unglamorous and essential. He sat down across from her. He poured himself the last of the wine. She's going to talk about medieval floors for a week, he said. That's fine. They're an interesting topic. He looked at her across the kitchen table, the real table, the Mrs. Okafor table, not the dining room table. Outside, November was doing what it did. Inside, the kitchen was warm in the way kitchens get warm when food has been made in them and people have sat in them, and the evening has been what evening should occasionally be. I want to say something, he said. She looked at him. All right. I have been... He stopped. He picked up the wine glass, put it down without drinking. I've been thinking about how to say this correctly for 3 weeks, and I've decided that there isn't a correct way, so I'm going to say it the direct way, and you can tell me if I've misread the situation. Okay, she said. I don't want this to be what it is, he said. A professional engagement, a contract, a defined thing with a scope and a timeline. He met her eyes directly. I want it to be whatever it is when you don't need the contract to explain why someone is in your life. Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the kitchen window. I want to be honest with you about something, she said, because you were honest with me in that diner in Astoria, and that set a standard I think we should maintain. All right. I'm not a simple proposition, she said. I have a thesis that isn't quite finished yet, and a career that's at its beginning, not its middle, and I need those things to be mine, not supported or underwritten or made easier by proximity to someone with resources. Mine. She paused. I'm not saying that's what you're offering. I'm saying it's what I need you to understand I'm not willing to trade. I know, he said, and then, I don't want to underwrite anything. I pointed at a door in an archive that you had already unlocked. That's different. Yes, she said, that's different. I want to be in your life in a way that doesn't require you to be smaller, he said. That's the thing. That's what I'm trying to say in too many words. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had switched to Italian in a restaurant to say something he didn't want overheard, and who had sent an email at 6 in the morning, and who had crouched next to a column joint with an 81-year-old Italian patriarch and talked about honest restoration, and who had frames of crayon drawings in his entrance hall, and who had come back to Florence when the board still had questions, and the legal team still had work, because the good arguments for staying in New York had not been enough. "You called me careless," she said, in Italian, in a restaurant in front of 40 people who couldn't understand you. "Yes," he said. No deflection, no qualification. "And then you sent an email at 6 in the morning." "Yes." "And you came to Astoria." "Yes." "Those are three very different versions of the same person," she said. "I know," he said. "The first one is what I am when I've been running on empty for too long, and I make the people closest to me pay for it, and then I don't understand why I keep ending up alone." He said it plainly, without drama, the way someone states a thing they've thought about long enough to stop being defensive about. "The other two are what I'm trying to be instead." Clara sat with that for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere upstairs, a 5-year-old was asleep with a rabbit named Bernard on the correct side of the pillow. "I'm not going to pretend the restaurant didn't happen," she said. "It happened. It's part of the record." "I know. And I'm not going to pretend that 6 weeks in Italy resolved everything, because 6 weeks in Italy under specific pressure with a defined goal is not the same as actual life. And actual life is harder and less coherent than that." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking for a resolution. I'm asking for a beginning." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she actually valued, work that was true, people who didn't pretend to be easier than they were. She thought about the ember that had refused to go out for 11 months, that had survived the restaurant, and the firing, and the $87, and the blinking cursor, and the 6 weeks in a foreign country managing a crisis that wasn't hers, and refusing a bribe that would have made everything financially simpler. "A beginning," she said, not a question. "Yes." She reached across the table and picked up his wine glass and finished what was left of it, which was either a statement or a gesture or both, and handed it back to him empty. "Then let's not ruin it by being too careful," she said. Something in his face did the thing, the unlatched thing, but more fully than she'd ever seen it. The management systems all the way offline for once, just the man sitting at the kitchen table in the house where the actual life happened. He looked younger, and more tired, and considerably more real. "No," he said, "let's not." The months that followed were not a montage. They were actual months, with actual friction, and anyone who wants to understand how Clara and Nathan worked in practice needs to understand that it was not simple. They argued about scheduling. He had a board meeting in Seattle the week she had a quarterly visit to the Ferretti properties, and neither of them could move, and they spent 3 days being terse with each other over phone calls before they figured out that the solution was for Clara to go to Florence and Nathan to go to Seattle, and for both of them to stop pretending that a relationship between two people with serious professional lives would be continuously convenient, because it wouldn't be. They argued about Lily's school. Not their argument to have technically, but Clara had a perspective, and Nathan had asked for it, and then pushed back on it, and then come around to it 2 weeks later and announced the decision without acknowledging that he'd changed his position, which Clara called him on directly, and he admitted it, which was a small but significant thing. He forgot things. He forgot a dinner they'd planned in December because a property emergency in Miami came up, and he texted her from the airport with 3 hours' notice, and she sat in a restaurant in the West Village alone for 20 minutes before she decided she was going to eat the dinner anyway because it was a good restaurant and she'd been looking forward to it. And she did. And then she told him exactly why that had been the correct response on her part and the incorrect response on his part. And they had the kind of conversation where both people say true things, and some of the true things are uncomfortable and nobody wins, but something is resolved. She had bad weeks. November's thesis submission was followed by December's waiting, the specific, hollow waiting of academic evaluation, of having put the thing out of your hands and into someone else's, and having no control over the timeline. She was restless and occasionally short-tempered, and once snapped at Lily about something small and felt terrible about it, and apologized directly, which Lily accepted with the pragmatism of a child who had been raised by someone who also apologized directly when they were wrong. Professor Mehta sent his response in the third week of January. Clara read it standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, still in the clothes she'd slept in, her phone shaking slightly in her hand. He had 2 significant notes on the third chapter, both of which incorporated the implications of the 1487 letter from Franco's archive, which Clara had been right about, which had opened a thread she'd followed for 6 weeks, and which had become the structural argument she'd needed. He had one note on the conclusion, which was that it was the best conclusion he'd read from a doctoral candidate in 11 years of supervision, and that the specific paragraph about stewardship versus custodianship was going to be cited in other people's work for a long time. She called Nathan. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd known she was waiting for this, and had been paying attention to the calendar. "It's good," she said. He said it's good. He was quiet for a moment. "Of course it is," he said, not as a performance of confidence in her, as a statement of fact about something he'd read enough of and heard enough about to actually believe. She sat down on the kitchen floor, just sat down, right there on the linoleum, back against the cabinet, and laughed. Not the managed laugh, not the professional warmth laugh, just the real one, slightly unsteady, the one that came from the place where 4 years of carrying something heavy had just become something else. "Clara," he said. His voice had the quality it had in the Fiesole night, specific and careful and real. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm better than fine. I'm on my kitchen floor." "Why are you on your kitchen floor?" "Because I sat down." A pause. "Do you want company on the kitchen floor?" "Yes," she said, "but not by phone." He was at her apartment in 35 minutes, which meant he'd left immediately, which meant he'd been dressed, which meant he'd been ready in a way that she understood was its own form of statement. He sat on her kitchen floor with her, and they drank the bad coffee she made because she still hadn't replaced the machine, and he read the section of Meta's email she showed him, and he said nothing performative about it, just read it and then looked at her with the unlatched face and said, "The stewardship paragraph. He's right." "I know he's right," she said. "I wrote it in Florence at 1 in the morning after I'd been up for 20 hours. "I know," he said. "I remember the night." She looked at him. "You remember the night?" "I remember most of what you tell me," he said. "I told you that." It was the second time he'd said it. She thought it might be something he'd keep saying, and she thought she might not get entirely used to it, which was probably the correct relationship to have with being known by someone. The thesis defense happened in March. Clara stood in front of a committee of 4 academics and talked about Renaissance cultural patronage and economic networks and a cloth merchant's letter from 1487 and the difference between stewardship and custodianship for 2 hours and 20 minutes. And she answered questions that were sometimes difficult and sometimes attempting to be difficult and sometimes genuinely curious and interesting. And she finished and stepped outside the room to wait, and Nathan was in the hallway. She hadn't asked him to come. She hadn't told him not to come. He was leaning against the wall in a way that looked casual and was clearly the posture of someone who had been waiting for a while and didn't want to make it visible that he'd been waiting for a while. And he was looking at his phone, but not at his phone, and when she came out, he looked up. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Since 11:15, he said. Her defense had started at 11. She looked at him. He met her eyes with the particular directness that had been his from the beginning. In the restaurant, in the diner, in Florence, in the kitchen in November, on the floor in January. The quality of someone who was willing to be seen looking. The committee door opened. The committee chair, a woman named Dr. Ferrara, which Clara had always found coincidentally satisfying, came out with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it correctly. "Dr. Bennett," she said. The title landed with the specific weight of something that had been a long time in the air and had finally reached the ground. Clara took a breath. The first quarterly visit to the Ferretti properties happened in April. Clara flew into Florence on a Wednesday evening and was in Aldo's farmhouse kitchen by Thursday morning, drinking the real coffee and going through her review notes with Franco, who had found 2 additional documents relevant to her now completed thesis, and who presented them with the satisfaction of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is vindicated. Aldo looked at the preliminary review notes with the attention he gave everything. Complete, detailed, the attention of a man who understood that the difference between things that lasted and things that didn't was in the quality of attention paid to them over time. The East Courtyard drainage, he said, pointing to a flagged item. The restoration team used a modern solution, Clara said. It works, but it's not period appropriate, and over time it'll create a visible contrast with the original stonework. I recommend they consult the same firm that did the Oltrarno Palazzo. They have a period-appropriate method. I'll tell Julia, Aldo said. He looked at the next page. Then he looked at Clara. Nathan is coming? Friday evening, she said. He has a board call Thursday. Aldo made a sound that meant, of course he does. And the child? Clara looked up from her notes. He's bringing her. She's been asking to see the cellar for 4 months. Aldo looked back at the notes, but something in his face did the thing it did when he was pleased about something and wasn't going to make a production of it. Good, he said. I'll tell Renata. She'll make the plantains. Aldo, Renata is Italian. Renata can cook anything, Aldo said, with the confidence of a man who had empirical evidence for this and was not entertaining doubt. Nathan arrived on Friday evening with Lily in the back seat of the car, asleep with her cheek against the window, and Bernard tucked under her arm in the specific position she required. He carried her into the palazzo without waking her, which Clara watched from the entrance hall, with the odd, particular feeling of observing something private that you've been invited to observe, which is its own kind of intimacy. Lily woke up in the morning to the orange trees. Clara heard her before she saw her. The sound of a child moving through a house with the focused energy of someone on a mission. And then Lily appeared in the courtyard doorway in her pajamas and looked at the orange trees with an expression of comprehensive evaluation. They're real, she said. Not to Clara, not to her father, who was behind her in the doorway with coffee. Just to herself and to the trees, confirming a thing she'd been uncertain about for months. I told you, Nathan said. Lily went to the nearest tree and put both hands on the trunk. She looked up through the branches. She looked at Clara. Franco said they smell like oranges. You talked to Franco? Daddy called him on the phone and I talked to him. She said this with the matter-of-factness of a child for whom calling an elderly Italian archivist on the phone was a normal thing that had happened. He said the cellar smells like time. Like old stone and time, Clara said. Yes. Can we go today? We're going to Villa Ferretti today, Clara said. The first hotel, the one Aldo's father restored. The cellar there is 600 years old. Lily looked at her for a moment with her father's dark eyes and her own entirely individual expression. Is Franco going to be there? No, Franco is in Umbria. Can we go to Umbria? Lily, Nathan said. That's a different trip, Clara said. But yes, we can go to Umbria. Lily turned back to the orange trees and stood there for another moment, her hand still on the trunk, confirming their reality one more time. Then she turned and went back inside, apparently satisfied, already planning the next thing. Nathan looked at Clara across the courtyard. The morning was doing what Florence mornings did. The orange trees were doing what orange trees did. Somewhere in the city, a bell was beginning to count the hour. She already has an itinerary, he said. I noticed, Clara said. She'll want to go to every property. Eventually, Clara said. That's all right. He looked at her with the unlatched face, fully open, not managed, the version she'd been learning for months and was still learning and thought she might always be in the process of learning, because people who are genuinely themselves don't arrive fully translated. You keep finding new registers. Clara, he said. I know, she said. I haven't said it yet. I know that too, she said. Say it. He crossed the courtyard. He stood in front of her with the orange trees behind him, and the bell counting the hour above them, and the whole old city doing its ancient and different business around them. And he said it, simply, without performance or preamble, the way he said everything that actually mattered, directly, as a fact about what he believed. She said it back, because it was also true, and true things should be said out loud sometimes. And this was the right courtyard, and the right morning, and the right person, and it had been moving in this direction since a wet floor in a Manhattan restaurant and an Italian insult, and the moment she had decided that she was not going to let something difficult convince her that she was less than what she was. She had not been less. That was the thing. She had been exactly what she was. And what she was had been enough. More than enough, as it turned out, for everything that had followed. Later, much later, after Villa Ferretti and the 600-year-old cellar and Lily's expression when she first smelled what Old Stone in Time actually smelled like, and after dinner at the farmhouse with Aldo and Renata's implausible jollof rice and the old dog under the table and Lily falling asleep against Aldo's arm while he was mid-sentence, which made the 81-year-old man go completely still and quiet. And after the drive back to Florence in the dark, Clara sat in the courtyard of the palazzo one more time, just her and the orange trees and the late evening. She thought about Salvatore Ferretti pressing seeds into fresh mortar while it was still curing, because he wanted something living in the wall for people he'd never meet. She thought about Aldo sitting on a bench with his hands in his pockets saying, "Now I can die in order." She thought about a blinking cursor, and $87, and an ember that had refused, stubbornly and without obvious reason, to go out. She thought about what it meant to stay, not to endure. Endurance was something you did when you had no other option, a form of waiting. Staying was different. Staying was a choice you made every day, about the work and the people, and the truth of what you believed you were. It was the seeds in the mortar. It was the blue door Aldo had left the wrong color for 37 years because his wife had been right, and he had known it. It was Nathan Holloway at 11:15 in a university hallway, not asked to be there, not performing being there, just there. The ember, the stupid, stubborn thing that had kept her functional for so long, had finally done what embers do when they get what they need. It had become something larger and steadier than itself, the kind of heat that didn't need to fight to keep going. She sat in the courtyard of the Florence Palazzo and listened to the city she kept coming back to, and she thought, this is what it feels like when the order of things is correct. Not perfect. Nothing she'd built or been given or chosen had been perfect. The column joint in the entrance hall was visible because imperfection, honestly kept, was more truthful than seamlessness. The east window at Villa Ferretti was still the wrong proportions. The parking garage in Vermont was still whatever it was. But correct. The things that were supposed to exist now existed. The work was real, and the people were real, and the life she was building had the right bones. The kind you find when you look past the surface condition, the kind that hold the weight. She stayed in the courtyard until the city finished counting the hour. Then she went inside, up the stairs, past the honest column joint and the restored frescoes, toward the room where the light in the morning came in at the angle that had no adequate description. She had a quarterly report to finish, and a paper she was co-authoring with Franco about 15th century commercial patronage networks, and a phone call with Julia tomorrow about the Umbrian drainage issue. And somewhere in the house, a 5-year-old who was going to wake up with 27 questions about medieval architecture and a rabbit named Bernard, who required specific placement, and a father who forgot things sometimes and was trying to be better at it. None of it was simple. All of it was hers. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.